The sun bled out over sagebrush forks, spilling crimson and rust onto the alkali flats. This was not a town. It was a scar, healing badly between the high, dry wound of Ashfall Butte and the low, festering damp of Willow Fen Basin. The wind was the only thing that moved with purpose, a high, thin whine that peeled paint from the false fronts and drove the grit into everything, into the eyes and teeth of the men who lingered on the boardwalks, into the watery beer at the Salty Dog, and into the soul. It pulled the sand into ribbons sharp enough to cut. Beckett Hale felt the grit on his teeth as his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Boulder, picked its way down the main thoroughfare. He rode tall, a man built of long angles and quiet, who seemed less to occupy his saddle than to be an extension of it. He was returning from Coyote Ledge, where he'd spent 3 days mending a line fence that hadn't needed mending, simply because the silence of the high rocks was preferable to the silence of his cabin at Red Hollow Ranch. He carried his loneliness the way he carried his rifle strapped tight, balanced, and never far from his hand. It was a dense, compressed thing, heavy as a keg of black powder, and the noise of the town grated against it. Sagebrush Forks was louder than it had any right to be. The temporary railroad terminus, built of raw pine and optimism, was vomiting noise. A locomotive sat panting steam, a black iron beast at the end of its tether. The chaos wasn't from the train itself, but from the knot of men gathered on the loading platform. This was Baron Rusk's doing. Beckett reined Boulder to a halt, his eyes narrowing. He didn't need to see Rusk to know his stink. The Baron, who owned the rail spur, the freight contracts, and half the county's water rights, was holding one of his labor settlements. A sharp-voiced man in a dusty derby hat, one of Rusk's foremen, was barking at a crowd of freighters, merchants, and bored saloon hands. Next lot indentured to the Central Valley Rail Company for a term of 2 years. Debt assigned at $50 passage, plus $20 keep. Who'll take the paper, who'll buy the contract on this fine specimen? A gaunt man with a hacking cough was shoved forward. Chains clinked, a sound that set Beckett's teeth on edge. This was Rusk's specialty, luring workers from the east with promises of railroad gold, then burying them in arbitrary fees for food, for tools, for shelter until their debt was a mountain they could never climb. Then he sold that debt to ranchers or freight bosses who needed cheap, bound labor. It was slavery by another name, dressed up in contracts and ledger books. Beckett's gaze drifted over the miserable line of assets. His eyes stopped. She stood apart from the others, not by choice, but because the crowd had formed a tighter, meaner circle around her. She was not gaunt like the railroad men, but she was worn thin, like fine cloth stretched to its limit. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe knot, but strands had escaped to cling to her damp temples. She was accused of something separate. "This one," the foreman sneered, his voice rising, "is special. Ava Marlowe, seamstress by trade, contracted to the Camp Taylors, caught lifting 3 bolts of blue calico, property of the CVR company." A murmur went through the crowd. Theft was worse than debt. "She denies it," the foreman spat, followed by a dry, hacking laugh from the men nearest him. Eva Marlowe did not flinch. She stood with her back impossibly straight, her hands fisted at her sides. On her left wrist, stark against the pale skin, was the raw, red chafe of a rope burn. She was looking at no one, her focus aimed somewhere over their heads, at the darkening line of the buttes. In the pocket of her worn gray skirt, her right hand gripped the only thing she owned. It was small, wooden, and smooth a cedar comb carved by the woman who had raised her back in Ohio, a woman whose face was growing harder to recall. The comb was her last piece of solid ground. "What's the bid on a thief?" shouted a freighter. "This ain't a debt auction, you fools!" A new voice, oily and self-important, cut through. A small, sweating man in a waistcoat 2 sizes too tight pushed his way forward. This was Magistrate Culpepper, a man who kept his gavel in Rusk's pocket. "This here is a legal matter," Culpepper announced, wiping his face with a stained kerchief. Miss Marlowe, having violated the terms of her employment contract through criminal action, and being without funds or surety, is declared forfeit. What's that mean? Judge. It means, Culpepper said, puffing up, that in lieu of jail time, which this town ain't got the funds for, her contract is voided and she is to be assigned to forced guardianship. Her labor, her person, to be remanded to the custody of an appointed guardian until such time as her debt of, he consulted a paper, $85.50 for the stolen goods and breach of contract is satisfied. Sold. Then, the foreman yelled, who'll be her guardian? Who'll pay the $85.50? A low, cruel bidding began. $40, $50. It was not a high price. The men were bidding on the woman, not the seamstress. Their eyes crawled over her, and with every bid, Ava Marlowe seemed to pull tighter into herself. She finally lowered her gaze. She looked at the magistrate, then at the foreman, and then, slowly, at the leering faces in the crowd. Her eyes, Beckett saw, were a clear, sharp gray. They were not frightened. They were not pleading. They were hot, and they were straight as a new needle. I did not, she said, her voice low but carrying on the wind. Steal the cloth. She speaks, the foreman mocked. Shut your mouth, girl. You'll speak when your guardian tells you. The bidding hit 65. 70, a voice said, flat and cold as a wet stone. The crowd turned. Beckett Hale had dismounted. He stood at the edge of the platform, his height casting a long shadow in the dying light. He didn't look at the foreman or the magistrate. He was looking at the woman. $70, the foreman repeated, his smirk fading. Beckett Hale was not a man to be mocked. He owned Red Hollow, a hardscrabble ranch, but he owned it outright. He was quiet, but he was no one's fool. Do I hear 75? Culpepper asked, nervously. Baron Rusk bids $85.50, a new voice said, smooth, polished. A man stepped from the shadow of the depot office. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, absurdly dark and heavy for the climate, but it made him look solid, permanent. He was clean-shaven, his face pleasant if not for the utter coldness in his eyes. This was Baron Rusk. He smiled, a brief, thin expression. The company will assume its own asset. He intended to take her, to make an example of her. 90, Beckett said. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the panting of the locomotive. Rusk's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. He studied Beckett, assessing him like a column in a ledger. 100, Rusk said calmly. 100, Beckett repeated, his gaze still on Eva. Is for ownership. I'm not bidding. I'm paying the fine. He moved past the foreman, up the 2 steps of the platform. The crowd parted for him. He walked to the magistrate's makeshift podium, a stack of crates. She was fined $85.50, Beckett said. His voice was rough from disuse, for breach of contract and theft. That is correct, Mr. Hale, Culpepper said, sweating again. And a 50-cent filing fee, Beckett added. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat. He opened it, and with deliberate, slow movements, counted out gold eagles and silver dollars. The sound of the coin hitting the crate was the loudest thing in the territory. And, Beckett continued, I require a contract of bonded labor, not guardianship, a fair contract, my ranch, Red Hollow, room, board, and $1 a week against her debt, plus wages for any additional skilled labor. Term to be concluded when the $85.50 is paid by her work. He looked at the woman. She a seamstress? The foreman, knocked off balance, nodded dumbly. Best in the camp, till she got greedy. My wife's sewing machine is sitting idle, Beckett said. He looked back at Culpepper. Drop the paper. Bonded labor. Red Hollow Ranch. Culpepper looked helplessly at Rusk. Baron Rusk stepped forward, his fine boots making no sound on the dusty planks. He stopped a foot from Beckett, though his smile was aimed at Ava. Mr. Hale, Rusk said, his voice pleasant. A noble gesture, but a foolish one. You're interfering in company business. This woman is a thief. You got your money, Beckett said, not looking at him. The town got its fine. The matter is settled. Is it? Rusk's cold smile returned. He looked Beckett up and down, from his worn boots to his sweat-stained hat. A word of caution. Rancher, whoever shelters my debtor owes me a debt, and I always collect. Beckett finally turned his head. He looked at Rusk. He said nothing. The weight of his silence was more of an answer than any threat could be. He turned to Ava Marlowe. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. He had seen women look at him with pity since his wife, Lydia, died. He had seen them look with calculation, weighing his land against his silence. He saw neither in this woman's eyes. She was assessing him. She was measuring him, just as Rusk had, but for different stakes. She was calculating her chances. She saw the worn denim, the calloused hands, the deep-set exhaustion in his eyes. She saw the absence of cruelty, but she also saw the absence of warmth. She gave him no soft gratitude, no weakening tears of thanks. She simply held his gaze and, after a long moment, gave a single, sharp nod. It was not submission. It was a pact for survival, a bargain struck in dust and desperation. The paper, magistrate, Beckett said. A dry, powder sleet, more ice than water, began to fall as Culpepper nervously scratched out the contract. The wind picked up, driving the small crowd back toward the saloon's yellow light. Behind them, watching from the depot office window, a thin man in a bowler hat noted the transaction in a small leather book. His name was Talon Pierce, and he was Rusk's shadow. He wrote down the time, the amount, and the destination Red Hollow. 10 minutes later, the paper was signed. Ava Marlowe's signature was clean and precise, a stark contrast to Culpepper's nervous scrawl. Beckett jerked his chin toward the buckboard parked near the water trough. Get in. He walked ahead of her, untying Boulder from the hitching post and tying him to the back of the wagon. Ava climbed onto the hard wooden seat. She did not look back at the depot. She did not look back at Rusk, who stood on the platform, watching them, his hands clasped behind his back. Beckett climbed up, his movements economical. He took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the two mules pulling the wagon lurched forward. The iron-rimmed wheels bit into the hardening mud. They left Sagebrush Forks behind. The road to Red Hollow was little more than a pair of ruts winding through the sagebrush, climbing steadily toward the dark shoulders of the mountains. The powder sleet turned the world gray. The only sounds were the steady clopping of the mules, the creak of the wagon harness, and the thin, sharp whine of the wind through the pines that began to line the road. They sat in silence. It was a heavy, cold thing, filling the space between them. Beckett kept his eyes on the road. Ava kept her eyes on her hands, fisted in her lap. She had traded one prison for another. This one was quieter. This one had trees, but it was a prison nonetheless. And this silent, broad-shouldered man was her new jailer. They were perhaps 3 miles from town when the wagon hit a deep rut. The jolt was sharp, rattling Ava on the hard seat. A small object was jarred loose from her pocket. It fell with a faint clatter onto the floorboards near Beckett's boot. He heard it. He stopped the wagon, the silence rushing back in, heavier this time. He looked down. It was a comb, small, dark wood, intricately carved. Ava's breath hitched. She made a move to grab it, but froze, her hand hovering in the air between them. It was a gesture of fear, the ingrained panic of someone who has had everything taken from them. Beckett watched her hand tremble for a moment before he leaned down, his movement slow, deliberate, his large, calloused fingers, stained with dirt and axle grease, closed around the small, delicate object. He felt the smoothness of the cedar wood. He did not inspect it. He did not ask what it was. He straightened up and turned, holding it out to her, flat on his palm. Ava stared at his open hand. She looked at the comb, then at his face. His expression was hidden by the brim of his hat and the falling dark. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she reached out and plucked the comb from his palm. Her fingers brushed his skin. It was the first time they had touched. Her skin was cold. She quickly pulled her hand back, clutching the comb to her chest. Beckett turned back to the road, gathering the reins. He gave them a gentle shake, and the wagon creaked forward. They traveled another mile, the darkness deepening, the sleet turning insistent. "Everyone," Beckett Hale said, his voice quiet, aimed at the mules' backs. "Everyone needs something to return to." The wagon wheels hit the dry, packed earth of the yard, and the sound changed, becoming a dull, solid thud. Red Hollow Ranch was not a hollow at all, but a wide, shallow bench of land pressed against the foot of a pine-covered rise. The cabin was built of lodgepole pine, each log notched with a precision that spoke of a patient, careful hand. The bark had been left on, and in the deep twilight, it looked less like a house and more like a part of the forest that had organized itself into a shelter. A single, massive chimney stood at one end, built of river stone, breathing a thin ribbon of old smoke. Beyond it sat a low, long barn and a web of corrals. The only sound was the creek so dry it barely whispered, and, from a grove of trees 100 yards off, the rustle of cottonwoods, their leaves, even in the faint wind, made a sound like a quiet, constant shushing, like 1,000 hushed conversations. Beckett pulled the mules to a halt. He sat for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands, as if gathering the will to re-enter his own life. Then he climbed down, his boots landing softly. He didn't look at Ava. He walked to the mules' heads, his movements unhurried, and began the work of unhitching. Ava remained on the wagon seat. Her entire body ached from the cold and the tension. This was it. She was property again, just under a different name. She slid off the seat, her legs weak, and landed in the yard. The dust was cold beneath her thin shoes. "Kitchen's open," Beckett said, his voice directed at the harness he was undoing. She moved toward the cabin, her steps stiff. The porch was 3 wide planks. The door was heavy pine, the handle a simple iron latch. She lifted it and pushed. The cabin was one large room, with a sleeping loft above and a curtained-off alcove that was, she assumed, his. But the main space was the kitchen. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint orange glow of embers in the stone fireplace. It smelled of cold ash, old coffee, and pine. Her hand, acting of its own accord, reached out in the dimness and found the surface of the central table. It was wood, sanded smooth but not varnished, the grain worn proud. Her fingers trembled as they rested on the solid surface. It was the first truly stable thing she had touched in months. There were no shackles here. The rope burns on her wrist stung with the memory. But the caution, the habit of flinching from a sudden movement or a raised voice, was branded deeper. She stood frozen, her hand flat on the table, breathing in the unfamiliar silence. Beckett entered behind her, his bulk filling the doorway. He didn't light a lamp. He crossed to the fireplace in the gloom, his steps sure. Ava tensed, moving back until her shoulders brushed the rough log wall, putting the table between them. He knelt. He took a piece of kindling, stirred the embers, and blew gently. A small flame caught. He added larger pieces, his movements economical. The fire bloomed, a sudden, warm orange. The light caught the surfaces of the room, a tin basin, a row of iron pans, a rifle resting on 2 wooden pegs above the mantel. The light illuminated him. It licked across the back of his hands as he arranged the logs. They were not just calloused. They were mapped with old cuts, rope burns, and the deep, ingrained grime of work. His life, Ava thought, was sewn together with these hands. A life made of wood and sweat, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. He stood, turning not to her, but to a dry sink by the door. He picked up a bucket. "Water's low," he said, and was gone again into the dark. Ava let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She was alone. She looked around. On a peg near the door, a woman's coat hung. It was heavy wool, dyed a dark blue, with a simple wooden toggle. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't displayed like a shrine. It was just there. A fact, like the empty chair at the table or the extra cup on the shelf. This was Lydia's house, the wife he had lost. Ava was an intruder, a ghost haunting a house that already had one. The door opened again, and Beckett returned with a full bucket, water sloshing over the rim. He set it down with a heavy thud and ladled some into a black kettle, which he swung on a hook over the growing fire. He moved to a tall cupboard, took down a sack of beans, a tin of lard, and a jar of spices. He began to cook. He worked with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown with the fire. He sliced salt pork into a heavy skillet. Soon, the sound of sizzling fat filled the cabin, and then the sharp, comforting smell of onion. He added the beans and water to a pot, then mixed cornmeal in a wooden bowl. The smells hit Ava like a physical blow. First, the cumin and black pepper, then the rich scent of the rendering pork, all of it weaving through the wood smoke. Her stomach, empty for what felt like days, didn't just growl. It seized in a painful, desperate knot. The hunger was so sharp it brought tears to her eyes, but it was tangled with something else. The simple, domestic act of a man cooking a meal not for a crew, not for profit, but just a meal felt impossibly, painfully kind. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She would not cry. She would not be weak. She owed him labor, not tears. "I can," she said, her voice rough. "I can help." Beckett paused, the wooden spoon halfway to the pot. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the full firelight. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a harsh command, just a statement of fact. "You're done in." He gestured to the bench near the fire. She obeyed, sitting on the very edge, her back straight, her hands locked in her lap. He finished with the food, putting a lid on the bean pot and sliding the skillet of cornbread into the small oven box built into the side of the chimney. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the bubble of the pot. "The room," he said, nodding toward a narrow door opposite his own curtained alcove. "Is there—" It's a storage room, but it has a cot." "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Beckett," he corrected her, not looking away from the fire. He served the food onto 2 tin plates, a thick slab of golden cornbread and a ladle of rich, thick bean stew. He placed one plate on the table in front of her. He did not invite her to eat. He simply provided the food. She ate. She tried to eat slowly, to be civilized, but the hunger was a ravenous animal. Every spoonful was hot and savory and real. It anchored her to the moment, to this cabin, to this man who had paid $100 for her fine. After, she stood and took her plate to the wash basin. She would work. She would prove she was not a thief, not a burden. "Mr. Hale Beckett," she corrected herself, her hands gripping the cold tin. "If I am to work, I would like a needle and thread, if you have any." He looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. He nodded slowly. He stood, went to a shelf near the hanging coat, and took down a small, round wooden box. He opened it. It was Lydia's sewing kit. Ava felt a cold shock, as if she'd touched a live wire. "No, I can wait. Tomorrow, in town." "It's just thread," he said, his voice flat. He pushed the box toward her on the table. "Things around here need mending, same as anywhere." She opened it. The thread was neatly wound on small wooden spools. thimbles, a packet of needles, a small pair of trimming scissors shaped like a stork. She took out a single needle and a spool of black linen thread. "What needs mending?" she asked. He gestured vaguely. "Everything." The next morning, she saw what he meant. The ranch was clean, but worn. It was the ranch of one man doing the work of three. She started where she stood. The leather strap on the well bucket was frayed, close to snapping. She sat on the porch steps, in the cold, bright morning, and went to work. She didn't just patch it. She took a scrap of discarded leather from near the barn, softened it with water, and reinforced the entire loop, her stitches small, tight, and perfectly even. Her needle moved with a calm, steady rhythm, like a slow heartbeat. In, out, pull tight. In, out, pull tight. It was a language she understood. Beckett watched her from the barn, where he was mending a bridle. He saw the way she held the leather, the set of her jaw, the absolute focus in her work. He'd seen men sew canvas, rough, big-knuckled work. This was different. This was control. Later that day, she found his work shirts, piled in a basket. They were torn at the elbows, missing buttons, seams giving way. She sat at the kitchen table, the fire warming her back, and mended them. She patched the elbows not with a clumsy square, but with a fitted piece of scrap, the seams neatly folded under. She re-sewed every loose button, reinforcing them with a small, hidden square of cloth on the inside. Beckett returned at midday, stamping the mud from his boots. He stopped, his gaze falling on the 3 neatly folded shirts on his cot. He picked one up, felt the elbow patch. It was smooth, strong. He looked at Ava, who was wiping down the table, her back to him. He said nothing, but he put the shirt on, and the fit was better than it had been in a year. The third day, the incident happened. A thin, high-pitched wail came from the cottonwood grove. It was a sound of pure panic. Beckett was in the high pasture, too far to hear. Ava heard it. She dropped the harness she was oiling and ran. She burst through the grove and into the small clearing by the creek. A young calf, perhaps 2 months old, was thrashing on the bank. Its back leg was hopelessly tangled in a length of old snare wire, left by a trapper or a thief. The more it pulled, the tighter the wire bit, cutting into its leg. "Easy," Ava whispered, slowing her approach. "Easy, now." The calf's eyes were white with terror. It scrambled, trying to get up, succeeding only in tightening the wire. Ava unknotted the heavy wool shawl from her shoulders, the one she'd found outside her door the first night, and moved in a slow, calm circle, keeping her voice in a low monotone. "I'm not going to hurt you. It's all right. It's all right." She lunged, not at the leg, but at its head. She threw the shawl over its eyes, blanketing its head and muffling its cries. The calf froze, its world suddenly dark and quiet. It trembled, but the thrashing stopped. "There now," she crooned, her hand on its neck, feeling the frantic pulse. "Just be still." She worked quickly, her fingers, nimble from a lifetime of needlework, probed the tangled wire. It was deep. She couldn't untwist it. She needed leverage. She looked around, found a sturdy, forked stick, using it as a prying tool. She worked the wire loop, twisting it against its own tension, easing the pressure. The calf grunted but remained blind and still under the shawl. The wire loop sprang free. She pulled the metal away from the bloody gash. "It's all right," she said, removing the shawl. The calf blinked, stunned, and scrambled to its feet. It stood for a second, then bolted, limping, back toward the pasture. Ava sat back on her heels, her hands covered in mud and blood. She was breathing hard. She hadn't known she was being watched. Beckett stood at the edge of the clearing, his horse's reins in his hand. He had seen the whole thing from the rise. He'd seen her run. He'd seen her calm the animal, seen her use the shawl to blind it, seen her work the wire. He'd seen her save it. He walked his horse forward. Ava looked up, startled, and scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands on her skirt. It was caught," she said, her voice defensive. Beckett stopped in front of her. His gaze dropped to her hands, then to the bloody wire on the ground, then back to her face. His expression, usually so guarded, had softened. It wasn't pity. It was respect. "You know how to save things," he said. It was not a question. "Not just sew 'em." He offered her a canteen. She took it, her hands shaking, and washed the blood and mud away. That evening, as she washed her face in the tin basin, she paused. The cabin was quiet. Beckett was outside, checking the perimeter, as he did every night. She had found a small, polished tin mirror, hardly bigger than a silver dollar, in her room. She held it up. She had expected to see the woman from the depot frightened, accused, diminished. But the face in the tin was different. Her hair was messy, her cheeks smudged with dirt, but her eyes were clear. Her mouth was not set in a plea, but in a firm, proud line. It was the face of a woman who had mended a bucket, sewn a shirt, and saved a life. All in 3 days. She was Eva Marlowe, and she was not broken. That night, before she went to her small room, she found Beckett had left something else outside her door. It was not a shawl this time. It was a small bar of lye soap, wrapped in clean paper. A simple, practical thing. A quiet acknowledgement. Ava went to her cot. She took the small cedar comb from under the thin mattress, where she'd hidden it. This time, she placed it under her pillow. She lay down and pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The cabin was warm from the fire. She could hear the faint, distant rumble of thunder over the mountains. A storm still far off. She could hear the wind in the cottonwoods, that endless shushing. For the first time since she'd left Ohio, she did not jolt awake at the sound. She slept. Outside, Beckett Hale did not. He sat on the porch, his chair tilted back against the log wall, his rifle across his lap. The distant lightning silhouetted his form. He was guarding the ranch. He was guarding the silence. He was a man made of wood and shadow. And, for tonight, his shadow stretched to cover the entire cabin. He looked like a fifth column, holding up the porch roof, solid and unmoving against the coming storm. The silence of Red Hollow was a living thing, different from the dead, hollow quiet of Beckett's life before. It was a shared silence. Now, it had texture. It was the scrape of Eva's spoon in the medicine bowl, the stamp of Beckett's boots on the porch, the rustle of the cottonwoods. Eva learned the rhythm of the place. It was a beat set by the sun, the needs of the animals, and the slow, steady progress of Beckett's work. She was stirring a mix of sulfur and lard in a small wooden bowl, a potent, sharp-smelling salve for a calf with mites. The smell of the chemical, of the grease, was sharp. It pricked her memory. Suddenly, she was not in the cabin. She was back in the railroad camp. The air was thick with the dust of uncut canvas and the metallic stink of machine oil. 20 women, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a long, unheated shed, their feet pumping the treadles of the heavy-duty sewing machines. Click-clack whir, click-clack whir, all day, from before sunup to well past sundown. They weren't sewing dresses. They were sewing heavy tarpaulins for the freight cars and tents for the survey crews. The man in charge was Silas Greaves, a foreman with a wet cough and eyes that lingered too long. The pay was a pittance, docked for every broken needle, for thread used, for the watery stew they were served. Ava, with her fast, precise stitches, was the only one who ever came close to clearing her debt. That was the problem. Miss Marlowe, Greaves had said, stopping by her station, his shadow falling over her work. Your tally sheet looks a little short this week. It's correct, Mr. Greaves, she'd said, not looking up. I counted the finished tarps myself. 22. My book says you were issued canvas for 25. That's a discrepancy, a costly one. She had looked up then. Then your book is wrong. The bolt you gave me was short. He smiled, a slow, unpleasant spreading of his lips. My books are never wrong, but perhaps we could review the numbers, privately. After the shift, come to my office. We might find an understanding. His meaning was as plain as a boot print in mud. It was the oral arrangement the other women whispered about, the one that meant better food, lighter work, and forgotten debts. Eva's hands had stopped moving on the canvas. There is no understanding to be had. Sir, the work is done. The tally is correct. I will not be reviewing it. His smile vanished. As you wish. 2 days later, the blue calico vanished. 3 full bolts, fabric for the surveyor's wives. Not the camp. And it was her storage chest that was found empty. She was accused, dragged before the camp manager. Rusk himself had been there, watching from the back, his hands clasped behind his back. I did not take it, she'd pleaded, not to the manager, but to the room. Mr. Greaves, he's lying. Check his own stores. Greaves produced a ledger, her signature, signing for the fabric. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but they didn't care. She was trapped. She had refused the oral arrangement, and this was the price. She was declared a thief, her contract voided, her debt tripled, and she was marched to the auction block in Sagebrush Forks. The clatter of the spoon against the wooden bowl brought her back. She was at Red Hollow. The smell was sulfur, not oil. She was safe. Her hand went instinctively to her pocket, to the smooth wood of the cedar comb. She pulled it out, her fingers tracing the carved flowers. It was her anchor. It was the last gift from her adoptive mother, a kind, sturdy woman named Elspeth, back in Mallow Creek, Ohio. Elspeth had found her, a lost, silent child, and taught her how to sew. She'd given her the comb the day Eva left to seek her fortune as a skilled seamstress with the railroad. The world is loud. Eva, Elspeth had said, pressing it into her hand. It will try to pull your thoughts into a tangle. Before you sleep, before you go out, you comb the piece in. You remember whose hands carved this and whose heart raised you. Don't let them unravel you. Eva closed her fist around it, the teeth biting into her palm. She had not been unraveled. She had been framed, sold, and stranded, but she was not unraveled. Across the yard, Beckett was splitting wood. The axe rose and fell with a steady, relentless rhythm. Thud, thunk, thud, thunk. He worked like a man trying to bury something, or to build a wall against it. He paused, leaning on the axe handle, wiping his brow. He looked toward the creek, his gaze distant. The water was running higher than usual, fed by the storm that had rumbled through 2 nights ago. The sound of it, a low, constant rush, was louder than the whispering cottonwoods. He was not seeing the creek. He was seeing the flood. It was 4 years ago. The rain had fallen for 3 straight days, a solid, gray sheet that turned the world to mud. He had been up on the high ridge, trying to move his small herd to higher ground, frantic as the dry arroyos turned into roaring, muddy rivers. Lydia was in the cabin. She had been delicate after the baby, and the boy himself. Little Owen was only 3 weeks old, small and quiet. When Beckett finally fought his way back to the bench, the cabin was gone. Not gone, shattered. The creek, which he had built a safe 50 yards from, was now a brown, churning monster that had ripped the cabin from its foundation. The sound was a roar, a physical weight that shook the ground. He found Lydia first. She had been tangled in the wreckage of the porch, half buried in the silt. He pulled her free, his hands shaking so badly he could barely lift her. She was cold. But the cradle, the carved pine cradle he had spent a month making it, was gone. He screamed Owen's name until his throat was raw, plunging into the thigh-deep, raging water, searching the debris, the downed trees, the mud. He searched all night. At dawn, he found the cradle. It was smashed against the cottonwoods. A mile downstream, it was empty. The emptiness was the horror. It was a hollow so vast it swallowed the sound of the storm, the world, his own heart. He buried Lydia on the rise, under the cypress tree she had loved. He had nothing to bury for Owen. 2 days later, when the water had receded and he was digging through the 3 feet of mud that filled what was left of his home, his shovel struck something. He knelt, his hand plunging into the cold, wet silt. He pulled it out, a single, tiny leather shoe, no bigger than his palm. He had found its mate the next day, washed up by the barn. He had buried them, just the 2 tiny shoes, in a small wooden box, next to his wife, under the cypress. His grief was a parallel line to Eva's. His was a chasm of sudden, violent absence. Hers was a canyon of slow, grinding injustice. They were 2 separate, distinct rivers of pain, flowing through the same small cabin. They did not touch. They did not compete for space. They simply existed, side by side, a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the scars that defined the territory of their lives. Thud! Thunk! The sound of the axe brought him back. He shouldered a load of wood and walked back to the cabin. Ava was in the barn, learning the work. She had a touch. She had mixed the salve and was now patiently applying it to the calf's leg, her voice the same low monotone he'd heard her use by the creek. The animal stood for her, trusting. Later, he found her in the main room, bent over his ranch ledger. He kept it by the fireplace, a tally of expenses, feed, and sales. It was a mess, his handwriting a functional scrawl. Eva had a jar of ink and his best pen. She was not changing his entries, but on a fresh page, she was organizing them. She created columns, hay tons, grain sacks, lie, medicine, calving live. Her handwriting was magnificent. It was not the flowing, ornamental script of a lady, but something better. It was sharp, economical, and perfectly clear. Every T was crossed with the precision of a stitch. Every A was a perfect, closed loop. Beckett stood in the doorway and watched. He was a carpenter by nature. He understood how things fit. He observed her the way he would measure a complex mortise and tenon joint, noting the angles, the strength, the load-bearing capacity. He respected the distance, the way she kept her own counsel, but he recognized the skill. She was not just a seamstress. She was an architect of small things. That evening, she approached him. "Beckett." He looked up from the harness he was oiling. "The kitchen curtains," she said, nodding to the 2 faded, thin pieces of calico hanging over the window. They were Lydia's. They were worn thin as ghosts, bleached by the sun. They offer no warmth, and they are sad. He felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. "They're just cloth." "Yes," she said, "which is why they should be useful." She held up his saddle blanket. Boulder, his bay, had a pressure sore from where the blanket had bunched. "If I may, I can unpick these curtains, pad them with carded wool from the shed, and stitch them into a lining for this. It would be better for the horse's shoulder." He looked at the faded curtains, then at her. She was offering to take a piece of his past, a piece of Lydia, and stitch it into his present, not to erase it, but to make it work. "Do it," he said, his voice rough. She spent 2 hours by the fire, her hands a blur. She took the old cloth, reinforced it, added the padding, and sewed it to the underside of the heavy wool blanket. Her stitches were invisible, but strong as iron. When she was done, it was a new thing, soft, thick, and perfectly shaped. He took it from her, his fingers pressing into the padding. It was better. The next day, Eva stood by the fireplace. She had been living at Red Hollow for over a week. Her little room was tidy, her few things in order, but she felt temporary. She pulled the cedar comb from her pocket. She had been hiding it, first under the mattress, then under her pillow. It felt like a secret. She looked at the log wall, at the space between the mantel and the kitchen shelves. It was the heart of the home. She stepped forward, and with a small, defiant gesture, she wedged the comb's handle into a wide, stable crack between two of the main logs. It stayed. It was small. It was just a comb, but it was hers. It was a small flag of her own, planted in the wall of his house, a declaration of self-ownership. Beckett came in for supper. He saw it immediately. His eyes locked on the dark wood of the comb, stark against the lighter pine of the wall. He saw its teeth, the carved flowers. He looked at Ava, who was stirring the bean pot, her back to him, her shoulders tense. He said nothing. He ate his supper. He cleaned his plate. The next morning, Ava came into the kitchen. Beckett was already gone, out to the pasture. She stopped. Next to her comb, there was a new nail driven into the log. From it hung a small, simple rain gauge, a glass vial held in a tin bracket. She stared at it. Her comb, a relic of her past, a symbol of her survival. His gauge, an instrument of the future, a tool for measuring what was to come. Two small, simple objects, hanging side by side. They had become the new, shared calendar of the house. Miles away, in Sagebrush Forks, the wind was picking up. It was blowing the alkali dust into the Salty Dog Saloon. Talon Pierce, Rusk's thin, quiet man, sat at a corner table. He pushed a $5 gold piece across the table to a man named Jedediah Sykes, a man known to sit on town juries. "Just curious," Talon said, his voice a low rasp. "What's the talk on Beckett Hale?" Sykes pocketed the coin. "Hale keeps to himself. Hard worker. Got dealt a bad hand with the flood some years back. Why? He bought a debt, day or so ago," Talon said, sipping his beer. "A seamstress, from Rusk's camp." "Heard something about that," Sykes admitted, nodding. "Paid $100. They say, fool move." "Baron Rusk," Talon said, leaning in. "Doesn't appreciate interference. He likes his accounts settled." He smiled. A thin, reptilian gesture. "He's very particular about his property." Talon stood up, leaving his beer half-finished. He stepped out onto the boardwalk. The wind had changed. It was coming from the east now. Off the high, dry plains, it no longer smelled of pine and damp earth. It smelled of dust, of lightning, and of trouble. A smell that gathered like static in the air. The cold woke Beckett first. Not the usual cold that seeped through the chinking, but a dead, wrong stillness in the pre-dawn air. The mules were restless in the barn. A low, nervous stomping. He was out of the cabin in an instant, pulling his boots on as he moved. The air was sharp, smelling of ozone and the dry, dusty scent of the high plains. He rounded the corner of the barn, his rifle already in his hand. The corral gate, the main one leading to the east pasture, was open. It wasn't just unlatched. The heavy rope lashing he used as a lock had been sliced clean through with a sharp knife. The corral was empty. All 40 head. A low curse rumbled in his chest. He turned back to the house, his strides long and angry. He didn't knock on her door. "Ava!" he yelled, his voice a flat crack in the stillness. "Get dressed! Riders! We've been hit!" She was out in a minute, her hair pulled back, her face pale but her eyes clear. She was stuffing her skirt into a pair of his old, too large denim trousers she'd found and altered. She didn't ask questions. She saw the cut rope, the empty corral. "Where?" was all she said. "They'll be pushing them east, toward the wash," he said, already moving to the barn, his mind racing. Glen Thistle Wash, a maze of narrow canyons and broken rock. Easy to lose a herd, easy to pick them off one by one. "It's Rusk. It has to be." He saddled Boulder, his movements fast and precise. He pointed to the stocking-legged mare in the next stall. "Her name's Juniper. She's got a soft mouth, but she's quick. Can you ride her?" I can ride, Ava said, grabbing the saddle blanket. He watched her for half a second. She moved with purpose, cinching the saddle tight, checking the bit. Her hands sure. She was not a rancher's daughter, but she had been paying attention. In less than 5 minutes, they were mounted, 2 rifles in scabbards, and a length of coiled rope on each saddle. They rode out of the yard at a hard canter just as the first sliver of a bruised purple sun broke over the buttes. They found the trail easily. 40 head of panicked cattle left a highway of broken brush and turned earth. They were moving fast, pushed hard. They're not trying to steal them, not yet. Beckett yelled over the sound of the hooves. They're trying to scatter them, lame them, cost me time and money I don't have. Then we don't let them, Ava called back. She kicked Juniper into a faster gait, moving up parallel to Beckett. He glanced over. Her face was set, her lips a thin line. She rode well, her back straight as a yardstick, moving with the horse, not fighting it. They pushed the horses for 2 hours, the trail winding deeper into the broken land. The sun was up now, hot and white, and the air was already baking. They heard the cattle before they saw them, the lowing, the clatter of rocks. They were in the mouth of the wash. Beckett crested a small rise and pulled Boulder to a sliding halt. Below them, in a wide, dusty bowl, the herd was milling in confusion. 2 riders on the far side were wheeling their horses, trying to haze the cattle deeper into the canyon. "We split," Beckett ordered, his voice low and urgent. "I'll take the high side. Try to turn them back west. You stay low, cut off their path into the wash. Don't let them get past you." He didn't wait for an answer. He spurred Boulder up the rocky incline. Ava took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not a sewing room. This was not a kitchen. She urged Juniper forward, down into the bowl. The 2 riders saw her. One of them, a heavy man on a black horse, broke away and rode hard, directly at her. He was yelling, waving his hat, trying to spook her mare. Ava held her ground. She uncoiled her rope. It felt heavy, unfamiliar, coarser than any thread she'd ever held. The man was closing. 50 yards, then 30. She didn't try to loop him. She didn't know how. She just swung the heavy, knotted end of the rope in a flat, fast circle, the way she'd seen Beckett do to haze a stubborn mule. The rope hissed. The rider, expecting her to turn and run, was surprised. He pulled his horse up, and the horse shied from the sound. That was all Eva needed. She rode past him, placing Juniper directly in the mouth of the canyon. A small, determined blockade. The man cursed and turned back to the herd. Up high, Beckett was having more success. He fired his rifle into the air, the sound echoing like thunder. The lead steers, panicked, turned from the high wall and began to circle back, away from the canyon. "They're turning! They're turning!" the second rider yelled. "We're not paid to lose 'em, fool!" a voice barked from above. Eva looked up. On a rocky ledge, not 30 yards from where Beckett was working, a third man stood. He was thin, in a bowler hat, and he was raising a rifle. Talon Pierce. "Beckett, above you!" Eva screamed. The world slowed. Beckett heard her, turned in the saddle, and saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. At the same instant, a pistol shot cracked from another direction, not from Talon, from a cluster of rocks to Ava's left. Beckett didn't think. He spurred Boulder straight down the scree slope, a suicidal slide of rock and dust, his body aimed at Ava. "Get down," he roared. He hit her just as the pistol flashed again. He didn't hit her horse. He slammed his own body into hers, knocking her clean out of the saddle. They fell together, a tangle of limbs, rolling into a shallow, dusty ditch as a bullet thwacked into the pine tree right where her head had been. Juniper and Boulder, reins flying, scrambled away. Beckett landed hard. The wind knocked out of him. With Eva underneath, he rolled off, grabbing for the rifle he'd lost in the fall. "Stay down." A man burst from the rocks, the smoking pistol in his hand. He was not Talon. He was big, bearded, and moving fast, coming to finish the job. Beckett's hand closed on his rifle, but the man was too close. He'd never bring it to bear in time. Eva, gasping for air, reacted. She had been thrown, her head had hit the dirt, but her hand had also found the small cloth sack she'd tied to her belt that morning. It held a handful of jerky, a biscuit, and, in a small, tight twist of paper, her pepper wadding. It was a mix of black pepper, cayenne, and sulfur, a potent blend she'd been mixing for the calf's mites. As the man lunged at Beckett, Eva scrambled to her knees and threw the contents of the paper straight into the man's face. It was not a bullet, but it was just as effective. The man screamed, a high, strangled sound, dropping his pistol to claw at his eyes. The cloud of red and yellow powder hung in the air. "My eyes, I'm blind, fire! It's fire!" Beckett didn't hesitate. He surged to his feet, reversed his rifle, and swung it like a club. The heavy wooden butt of the stock connected with the man's temple with a sickening solid thunk. The man dropped like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence, the sudden, ringing silence after gunfire. The cattle were gone, scattered. The other two riders were gone. And from the ridge above, Talon Pierce was gone. Beckett was breathing hard, his heart a drum against his ribs. He looked at Eva. She was kneeling in the dust, her hands scraped raw, her face streaked with dirt. She was trembling, but her eyes were dry and fierce. He offered a hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. You threw pepper at him," Beckett said, his voice rough with disbelief. "It's what I had," she said, her voice shaking. She looked at the man on the ground. "Is he—" "He'll wake up with a skull-sized headache," Beckett said grimly. He knelt and, using his own rope, tied the man's hands and feet. He found a piece of paper tucked into the man's vest. He pulled it out. It was a bill of sale for 20 head of cattle, already filled out, and scrawled on the back, in a precise, neat hand, was a message. "Rusk wants the person and the debt. This is the first asking. It will not be gentle." Beckett crushed the paper in his fist. He looked at the long, empty wash, then back at Eva. "This isn't about cattle anymore." They left the man tied and rode to Sagebrush Forks, retrieving their horses and leaving the scattered herd for another time. Beckett marched into the small, dusty office of Elias Adair, attorney at law. Adair was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of polishing them. He listened, his brow furrowed, as Beckett, his voice tight with a cold rage, laid out the story. "The bond paper is legal, Beckett," Adair said, holding the document up to the light. "You paid the fine. You signed the labor contract. She's bonded to you, not Rusk." "Then tell him that." Beckett slammed his hand on the desk, making the inkwell jump. "It's not that simple," Adair countered, his voice rising in frustration. "Rusk isn't operating on this piece of paper. He's operating on his piece of paper." Adair pulled a file from a drawer. "A source of mine got me this. It's a copy. Rusk has a separate ledger, one for the rail company. In it, he doesn't have Eva Marlowe down for an $85 theft. He has her down for a $300 debt. He's claiming she destroyed, not stole, the fabric, and he has a stamp from the Territorial Marshal's office in Prescott, a man we all know he pays certifying the debt. Your $100 fine, he's treating that as a down payment." "A down payment," Beckett repeated, the words tasting like ash. "He's claiming she's still his. He's claiming her debt is still his, and by sheltering her, you've assumed it. He'll put a lien on Red Hollow before the month is out." Beckett stood still, the trap closing around him. He had paid, but Rusk had simply changed the price. "No," a voice said from the doorway. Eva stepped into the office. She had waited outside, but she had heard every word. Mr. Adair," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a new, hard authority. Baron Rusk's power comes from his ledgers. He believes no one can read them but him." "What do you mean, child?" Adair asked, squinting. "I mean, he is a freight man, not a cloth man," Ava said, stepping up to the desk. "I was the head seamstress. I kept the real books. I know his inventory. I know every bolt of canvas, every spool of thread, every gross of buttons he ordered. I know what he paid, and I know what he said he paid." She looked at Beckett, her eyes shining with a cold, focused anger. "Rusk thinks his ledger is a hammer, but I know it's a badly sewn garment. He's been skimming from the railroad for a year, inflating his freight costs, billing for ghost supplies. The blue calico I was accused of stealing, it never existed. He billed the company for it, but it was never delivered. He framed me to cover his own theft from his employers." Adair stared at her. Can you prove this?" "I can," Ava said. "I remember the receipts. I remember the shipping manifests. He thinks his numbers are his alibi, but I can make them his noose. One loose thread. Mr. Adair. That's all it takes to pull down an entire curtain." The ride back to Red Hollow was silent, but it was a new silence. It was the quiet of two conspirators. That night, there was no pretense of employer and worker. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low. "I need paper," Ava said. "A lot of it, and a clean ledger book." "I have one," Beckett said. He got up, went to his room, and brought back a new, leather-bound book, one he'd been saving. "We can't keep it here," he said. "Talon, or men like him, they'll be back. They won't just scatter cattle next time." He looked at the fireplace, then at the floorboards. "Here." He took the poker and pried up a wide plank near the hearth, one he knew was loose. Beneath it was a shallow, dirt-floored crawl space, dry and dark. "It's not deep, but it's hidden," he said. He went to the barn and returned with an old, sturdy grain bin, small enough to fit. "We put the book in here. It's tin. It'll keep the damp out." They made a new vault, a secret place under the kitchen floor, their proof chest. While Eva began to write, her memory pouring onto the pages in her neat, precise script, Beckett went to work on his own defenses. The town was already turning. When he'd gone to the sheriff, a man named Tyndall, about the attack, the sheriff had just shrugged. "Sounds like a dispute over a debt. Hale, not my jurisdiction. You sure you didn't provoke him?" The rumors were flying. That night, at the Salty Dog, the talk was that the quiet widower at Red Hollow had lost his mind. "Paid $100 for Rusk's cast-off," one man slurred. "They say she's bewitched him. Got him seeing ghosts." Ava heard the whispers when she went to the mercantile for flour the next day. The women, who had once nodded to her with shy pity, now pulled their skirts aside. "That's her, the one who's shacking up with Hale, the one who caused all the trouble." Ava kept her chin high. Her back remained straight. She paid for her flour, met their stares with her own clear, gray eyes, and walked out. She was silent, but her silence was not submission. It was a whetstone. That night, Beckett hung a small, brass bell from the newly repaired corral gate, rigging it with a tripwire. Any movement would set it ringing. Then he took 2 pieces of Lydia's old vanity mirror, the one that had cracked in the flood. He nailed them to the posts of the porch, angled just so. In the moonlight, they would catch any movement in the yard, flashing a light trap visible from his window. He was fortifying his home. As they locked the ledger, now half filled with Eva's damning testimony, into the grain bin and lowered it into the earth, the wind picked up. It wasn't the high, thin whine of before. It was a low, heavy moan. Beckett stepped outside, Ava joining him on the porch. The sky to the west was no longer clear. It was a solid, bruised purple mass, churning and dark. The smell of ozone, the smell of the morning's attack, was back, but stronger now, thick with the promise of rain. The first big storm of the season was about to break, and it was coming for them. The sky broke open. It was not a gentle rain. It was a solid wall of water that slammed into Red Hollow, a sudden, violent unleashing. The wind, which had been a low moan, became a high-pitched, grieving shriek. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound like the mountains splitting apart, and the windows of the small cabin rattled in their frames as if invisible fists were trying to break in. Beckett was outside, making a last-ditch effort to secure the barn door, which was threatening to rip from its hinges. Ava watched from the kitchen window, her hands clenched. The yard had become a river of mud in less than 10 minutes. The door burst open, and Beckett stumbled in, hauling a final, massive armload of firewood. He was drenched. The rain had plastered his dark wool shirt to the muscles of his back and shoulders, and water streamed from his hat. He kicked the door shut, barring it against the howl of the storm, and dropped the wood into the hearth box with a wet clatter. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, pushing the wet hair from his eyes. "You'll catch your death," Ava said, her voice quiet. She had already taken a dry towel from the shelf. She moved toward him, her steps hesitant. He was a large, imposing figure in the small kitchen, and the storm seemed to cling to him, radiating cold. She held out the rough linen. He took it, his eyes finding hers in the dim, firelit room. "Thank you." As he took the towel, his chilled, rough fingers brushed the back of her hand. It was an accident, a contact that lasted no more than a second, but it felt like a static spark in the deluge. She pulled her hand back as if burned, and he turned quickly, rubbing the towel over his head, breaking the moment. Then they heard it. A new sound, distinct from the roar of the rain and the howl of the wind. "Drip, drip, drip!" Beckett's head snapped up. He looked at the ceiling, his jaw tight. A dark, spreading stain was forming on the pine boards directly above the table. "Damn it," he muttered. He grabbed the empty water bucket. "The loft!" He took the ladder steps 2 at a time. Ava followed him, her heart sinking. He pushed aside a stack of trunks in the low-ceilinged loft, revealing a widening puddle on the floor. Above it, the roof shingles were clearly giving way. "It's the seal around the chimney stack," he said, his voice tight with anger. He threw old canvas sacks onto the puddle, but they were soaked in seconds. "It'll come through the kitchen ceiling before midnight. It'll ruin the flour." "What can we do?" she yelled over the roar of the rain on the roof. "I have to get up there. Try to patch it with tar. In this, you'll be blown off." "It's that or lose the roof," he said. He was already moving back down the ladder. He grabbed a bucket of thick, black roofing tar from the porch and his hammer. He looked at the ladder leading up the outside of the cabin to the roof. It was slick with rain. "No," Ava said, grabbing his arm. It was the first time she had touched him on purpose. "It's not worth your life. We can move the flour." "It's not just the flour. Ava, it's the house. If the water gets into the main joists, they'll rot. We have to stop it now." He shrugged off her hand and went outside, into the black, churning chaos. She watched from the doorway, her hand over her mouth. He fought his way to the ladder, the wind tearing at him. "The ladder!" he roared back at her, pointing to its base. "It's slipping in the mud. I need you to brace it." She didn't hesitate. She ran out into the storm, the icy rain hitting her so hard it stole her breath. She grabbed the 2 side rails of the ladder as he began to climb, planting her feet in the sucking mud and throwing her entire, small weight against its base. "Hold it steady!" he yelled. She held on, her knuckles white, her face turned up into the driving rain. She watched him climb. He was a dark shape against a darker sky, illuminated only by the brief, terrifying flashes of lightning that split the hills. He was carrying the heavy tar bucket. The wind caught him as he neared the top, and the ladder shuddered, but she held firm, her feet sliding but not giving way. He disappeared onto the roof. She was left alone in the mud, her only job to be the anchor. She counted to 100, then started over. She was shaking so violently from cold and fear she thought her teeth would crack. but she did not move. After what felt like an hour, his boot appeared on the top rung. He came down, his face pale and grim, but the tar bucket was empty. He stepped off the last rung, his chest heaving. He was so close she could feel the cold radiating from him. The brim of his hat dripped water onto her face. He looked down at her drenched hair plastered to her skull, her small frame braced against his ladder, her entire body trembling. A small, exhausted, and utterly rare smile cracked the corner of his mouth. It was a flash of warmth in the freezing rain. "Let's get inside. Seamstress," he said, his voice rough. He put a hand on her back, not in intimacy, but to guide her, to push her toward the door. You held steady. Inside, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. The dripping had slowed to a crawl. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering, their teeth chattering. "The fire," Beckett said, his voice thick. Get by the fire." He added 3 new logs, and the flames roared up, fighting back against the cold. They stood there, dripping on the hearthstone, the silence between them thick. "We need to get out of these clothes," he said, his voice practical. He didn't look at her. He turned his back, moving toward his own curtained-off alcove. "There's an old shirt of Lydia's in the trunk in your room, and a blanket. Get warm." He disappeared. Ava fled to her own room, her fingers numb. She found the clothes, peeled off her own freezing, mud-caked dress, and wrapped herself in the dry blanket, pulling the old wool shirt on underneath. When she came back out, Beckett was already by the fire, his back to her. He had changed into dry denim trousers and a flannel shirt. The storm was a howling, invisible animal, clawing at the logs. But the cabin was holding, the patch was holding. "We should eat," he said, his voice quiet. The shared danger had scrubbed them both raw. "Something hot." They moved to the stove, into the small, warm circle of light. They didn't speak, together. They began to make soup. He peeled potatoes, his large hands surprisingly deft. She chopped the onions, her movements quick and sure. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms brushing as they reached for the salt or the spoon. The small, domestic sounds the chop of the knife, the scrape of the pot were a defiant comfort against the violence of the thunder. The heat from the iron stove and the bubbling pot began to seep into their bones, chasing away the last of the chill. But it was more than the fire. It was the warmth of another person, a shared presence in the face of the storm. The heat of his arm, so close to hers, felt more potent than the hearth. After they ate, the tension did not leave. It simply changed. The adrenaline of the storm had faded, replaced by something quieter and far more taut. Eva had been working on a gift, a secret project, for the past week. She'd found a bolt of good, thick wool flannel, saved from the flood, and had been stitching it by hand in her room at night. She retrieved it now. "I finished this," she said. He turned. She was holding a vest. It was a dark, simple gray, lined with quilted cotton, the stitches perfect. He stared at it. "It's for you," she said, her voice small. "For the cold." He took it. The wool was soft. He looked at the stitches, the work of her hands. "Ava." "Try it on," she said. "I need to check the fit." He nodded, his throat tight. He pulled it on over his shirt. It fit well. "Turn around," she commanded softly. He obeyed, turning his back to her, offering her the same trust she had offered him at the ladder. He stood, exposed, vulnerable. Eva stepped closer. Her hands, the hands that had saved his calf, that had gripped his ladder, now rose to his shoulders. Her fingers, so precise and light, smoothed the wool over his shoulder blades, checking the seam. The touch was professional, the touch of a tailor, but it was a touch nonetheless. He stood perfectly still. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap and underneath that, just her. The distance between his back and her front was no more than the thickness of a single breath. Her hands moved from his shoulders down to the small of his back, smoothing the fabric. It fits," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," she whispered. He turned to face her. She didn't move away. They were standing in the small space between the table and the fire, a pocket of warm, amber light. The firelight dyed their skin the color of honey and cast their shadows, tall and intertwined, against the log wall. A fine sheen of perspiration, from the heat of the fire and the soup, was on both their temples. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the strength in her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the pride that held her spine straight. "Ava," he said, his voice low. "Not a demand, not a request. If you feel safe." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. He was not asking for a favor. He was acknowledging her past, her fear, her right to her own space. He was giving her the one thing Rusk had tried to steal the choice. She looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and deep. She held his gaze, and in it, she saw no threat. She saw the man who had bought her bond, the man who had let her save his calf, the man who had climbed a roof in a hurricane, the man who had just trusted her at his back. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. She leaned back, just a little, and her shoulders met the rough, warm logs of the cabin wall. She pressed against the log cabin wall, her breathing quickening, but the fear was gone. It was replaced by a sharp, clear stillness. Beckett took one step, then paused, his shadow covering hers. His gaze was steady, asking permission again, giving her a final chance to turn away. She didn't move. He rested his hand on her hip, his thumb just brushing the seam of her dress. The touch was light, a question, a statement of intent. It sent a jolt of pure, liquid heat through her, a feeling so foreign she almost gasped. Then, slowly, his hand began to move upward. His fingers, calloused and sure, traced the line of her spine, through the fabric. Ava's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't pulling her. He wasn't demanding. His fingers continued their slow, respectful path, mapping her, learning her, until they reached her shoulder blade. He stopped. "You're caught," he whispered, his voice thick. His eyes told her that was the excuse, not the reason. His fingers, which had found a small, rough splinter in the log, gently worked the fabric of her shirt free. But his hand remained on her back, a warm, heavy, solid presence. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled so tight it was vibrating. He had respected her boundaries. He had given her the choice. Now she made it. Ava lifted her hands, not to push him away, but to rest them on his shoulders. She felt the solid muscle beneath the flannel. Then she slid them up, lacing her fingers behind his neck. She pulled the remaining distance. The kiss was deep, but it was soft. It was not a collision, it was a discovery. It was the taste of wood smoke and rain and the salt from the soup. It was a long, slow exploration, a question and an answer in one breath. For Beckett, it was the first warmth he had allowed into the frozen place Lydia had left behind. For Eva, it was the first touch she had ever received that was not about ownership or power, but about shared shelter. It was trembling, and it was uncertain, but more than anything, it was safe. Their breath mingled, their heartbeats a frantic, stumbling rhythm, trying to find a shared beat. Ava was the one to break it, but she only pulled back an inch, her hands still locked around his neck. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. She was trembling. She brought one hand down, laying it flat against his chest, over his heart. She felt the frantic, solid thump, thump, thump beneath her palm. He mirrored the gesture, placing his own large, warm hand over her heart, feeling its rapid, bird-like pulse. He leaned his forehead against hers, Their breath shared.
"Here, Eva,"
he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "At Red Hollow, you decide." She let out a long, shuddering breath. "I know," she said, and she kissed him again, this time with no hesitation. The storm raged on outside, but the sound was distant now, muffled. The thunder was just a low drum, far away. Later, they didn't go to their separate rooms. They sat on the braided rug in front of the hearth, their shoulders touching, their hands clasped. The storm had passed, both outside and in. They were just two people, sitting in the warm, quiet glow of a fire, watching the embers burn down, safe in the house they had saved together. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cold. The dripping from the roof patch had stopped. The night had changed them. The space between Beckett and Eva was no longer a cautious void, but a shared territory, earned and defended. But the dawn brought back the other, colder reality. It brought back Rusk. They unburied the grain bin from beneath the floorboards. The ledger was dry. By the light of the morning fire, Eva opened it, dipped the pen in the inkwell, and the investigation began.
"He's not just a brute. Beckett,"
she said, her voice low, her brow furrowed in concentration.
"He's an accountant. He hides his crimes in his numbers. We have to unravel them, one thread at a time."
She didn't need to see the warehouse. She had it in her head. She began to draw, her hand moving with the same precision she used for a dress pattern. She drew the long, low building of the railroad supply depot.
"Here,"
she said, tapping the paper. "Main storage, canvas, rope, machine oil. This small, locked room here, that's where he kept the finer goods. The calico, the wool, the linen thread, the supplies for the wives." She drew a small X by the door. Silas Greaves, the foreman, had one key. Rusk had the other. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing. The manifests, they came in on the Tuesday train. Greaves would check them in. He would mark them with the company receiving stamp. Then, Rusk would audit them. "What does that mean?" Beckett asked. He was sitting opposite her, a fresh page of his own ledger open, ready to take notes. It means he'd take the manifest, go into the office, and when he came out, he'd have a new tally. He'd declare half the spools damaged, or a bolt of canvas inferior quality. He'd write it off against the railroad's account. But the goods, they never left the depot. They just disappeared. He resold them, Beckett said. To miners, to the saloons, even to the army post at Fort Emery. Eva confirmed. He sold the railroad's own goods back to them, twice, but he needed the paperwork to look right. He needed the company stamp. Beckett leaned forward. "You said stamp. Adair mentioned a forged stamp." "It wasn't forged," Eva said, a new hardness in her voice. "It was real. That's the part I couldn't understand. The receipt he showed, the one that proved I took the blue calico, it had the official company receiving stamp, the one I saw Greaves use every single day." She stared into the fire, her mind working, stitching pieces together. The stamp, it was heavy brass, set in an oak handle. Greaves kept it in the top desk drawer. It used purple ink. I remember Greaves always had a smudge on his hand. Beckett watched her. A smudge. "Yes," she said, her eyes widening. "He was left-handed. When he pressed the stamp down, he'd brace his hand on the paper, and the side of his palm it would always catch the edge of the fresh ink. A little purple crescent, right on his left palm." She looked at Beckett, her gaze sharp. "The day I was accused, Rusk's man, Talon Pierce, was in the office. And later, when Rusk presented the evidence to the magistrate, Talon had the smudge on his right hand." Beckett's pen stopped moving. "He has a second stamp, a duplicate. Rusk has his own stamp made." "Exactly," Eva said. "Greaves, the left-handed man, used the real stamp. Talon, the right-handed man, uses Rusk's. It's the same design, but the smudge is on the wrong hand." Her energy was a palpable thing, a low, hot fire.
I can prove it. I know the real stamp. I saw it every day.
The R in railroad had a small nick on the upper curve, a tiny, tiny flaw. She grabbed a piece of scrap canvas and her ink.
I can draw it. I can show Adair the difference. I can recreate the real seal.
Beckett wrote it all down. Column 1 date, column 2 manifest number, column 3 item, column 4 discrepancy. He was building a wall of facts, using her memory as the mortar. 2 days later, they rode to Sagebrush Forks with the new damning pages hidden in Beckett's boot. They met Adair in his dusty office, the door locked. The lawyer's eyes widened as he read. This is meticulous. Miss Marlowe, the drawing of the stamp, the detail on the R, this is powerful. But it's your word against Rusk's.
It's his word against the railroad he's stealing from.
Eva countered.
Precisely,
Adair said, polishing his spectacles. Which is why we must have a town hearing. We won't accuse him of theft. Not yet. We will petition Magistrate McKinnon to review the legality of your debt. We will use this evidence to prove the debt itself is a fabrication. He tapped the paper. But Rusk will bring Greaves. Greaves will lie. Talon will lie. It will be their word against yours. We need a third party. We need a witness who saw the blue calico after you were accused of stealing it. Beckett looked at Eva. Her face was pale. A witness from the camp. They were all terrified of Rusk. Eva was silent for a full minute. Then she looked up.
Mrs. Tilda.
Who? Adair asked. Tilda May, Eva said.
The camp cook. She's a big woman, afraid of no one. She hated Greaves.
About a week after they took me, I heard Greaves complaining. He said, that old bat Tilda came round, demanding canvas for a new pie safe cover. He said he gave her a bolt of damaged blue calico to shut her up. The stolen calico, Beckett said, his voice a low growl. It has to be, Eva said.
She'd remember. If she still has that canvas, it's proof it was never stolen. Where is she?
Adair asked. Rusk fired her a month ago, Eva said, her hope faltering. She had a sister, I think, over at Brim Willow Junction. That's a good 50 miles from here.
Then you must go, Adair said. Find her. Get her to sign an affidavit. Better yet, bring her back. But for God's sake, be careful. Rusk has eyes everywhere.
He was right. As Beckett and Eva left the office, Talon Pierce stepped out of the shadow of the assay office across the street. He didn't look at them. He just tipped his bowler hat to a man leaning against a post, one of the riders who had scattered Beckett's herd. The man nodded, mounted his horse, and trotted out of town, heading west. A tale. Beckett saw it all. He said nothing until they were a mile out of town. We're being followed, he said, not looking back. I know, Eva said, her back straight.
So what's the plan? Rancher?
The plan, Beckett said, a grim set to his jaw, is to give him something to follow. He turned their horses north, not south, toward Brim Willow. They rode to Red Hollow. That evening, Beckett hitched the mules to the heavy buckboard wagon. He loaded it with 4 empty, tarp-covered barrels.
Where are we going?
Eva asked. We're not, he said. He is. He pointed to the top of the ridge. He's up there, waiting to see what we do. He thinks we're running. So we'll run. At 3 a.m, under a sliver of moon, Beckett led the wagon out of the yard. He drove it hard for 2 miles, the empty barrels rattling, making a terrible noise. He took the main road, the one that led north, the opposite direction from Brim Willow. He drove to a dry wash, unhitched the mules, and tied them to the wagon wheel. Then he simply walked back to the ranch, cutting across his own pastures, his steps silent. He'll follow the wagon, Beckett explained, back in the cabin, blowing out the lamp. He'll wait, see if we make camp. By the time he realizes it's a decoy, it'll be dawn, and we'll be halfway to the junction, on horseback, on the South Trail. They left an hour before sunrise, riding boulder and juniper. They kept to the low arroyos, the horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. By the time the sun came up, they were 10 miles gone, and the northern road, with its decoy wagon, was empty. They stopped at midday at way station number 9, a lonely collection of sod buildings on the territorial line. It was a place for freight wagons to change teams, run by a sour, by-the-book deputy clerk named Mr. Hemlock. While Beckett watered the horses, Eva, on a hunch, went inside. "I'm here," she said to Hemlock, "to inquire about the territorial fee schedule for bonded labor." Hemlock, annoyed, pulled down a massive, dusty ledger. "What about it?"
"If a fine is paid, say, $85.50.
Ava said, "Is there a territorial holding fee or transfer tax on top of that, say, another $200? Hemlock's head snapped up. "What? A $200 tax? That's preposterous. That's highway robbery. The only fee is the 2-bit filing stamp. Who told you such a thing?" "A potential employer, Baron Rusk." Ava said. Hemlock's face turned a mottled red. "Rusk, that man thinks he is the territory. He's been charging his own fees for years. It's illegal as sin, girl, but no one's had the spine to challenge him. You tell whoever that Elias Hemlock at Way Station 9 confirms, in writing, that any fee over $1 is theft, plain and simple." He scribbled a note on a piece of official paper, signed it, and stamped it with a black ink stamp. Eva tucked the paper into her shirt. Another piece, another stitch. They made camp that night by a small, nameless creek. The air was cold, but the small fire Beckett built was warm. They sat on their saddle blankets, eating jerky and the hardtack biscuits Eva had packed. "You ride well," Beckett said, breaking the silence. "And you know horses and snares. Where did a seamstress learn all that?" Ava smiled, the first truly relaxed smile he had ever seen on her. My father, the man who raised me, Elspeth's husband, he was a saddler. He didn't just sew. He worked leather. He taught me the difference between a running stitch for cloth and a locking stitch for leather. He taught me how to read a horse's back, to see where the saddle would pinch." She looked at her hands. "He said a good saddle was like a good dress. It had to fit the body it was made for. He was a good man, quiet, like you. He taught me how to be still, how to watch." She looked at him. "And you knew the storm was coming. You were patching the roof before the first drop fell. You read the clouds." Beckett nodded, staring into the flames. "My PA taught me, you don't look at the color. Everyone looks at the color. You look at the shape and the speed. See those high, thin ones, the ones that look like pulled thread? They're mares' tails. They mean wind is coming, high up, but if they're moving fast, and the low, clumpy ones are moving slow, in a different direction, that means the sky is twisting. That means the air is fighting itself, and when it fights, it breaks. That means hail, or worse." He poked the fire. "It's just paying attention, seeing the pattern before the seam rips." Eva nodded. "We're not so different. Then, a rancher and a seamstress." "No," he said, and his eyes met hers. "Not so different." They sat in a comfortable quiet. Ava leaned her head back, looking at the stars. "We don't break, Beckett," she said softly. "We don't burn his warehouse. We don't become him. We prove," Beckett finished, his voice a low, solid promise. "We just prove." The quiet was shattered by the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. "Well, now," a voice rasped from the darkness beyond the fire. "Ain't this cozy?" Talon Pierce stepped into the light. He was not alone. 2 of Rusk's men fanned out behind him, their pistols drawn. The man Beckett had knocked out in the wash was one of them, a fresh, ugly bruise on his temple. "You're a harder man to follow than I thought. Hail," Talon said, his thin smile not reaching his eyes.
The wagon was a nice touch, but you left tracks. And you stopped at the way station. Mr. Hemlock is talkative. Rusk won't be happy to hear about his illegal fees. He took a step closer. The Baron is tired of this. He wants the girl, and he wants the book, the one you're building with the lawyer. Beckett slowly got to his feet. Ava stood with him, her hand moving, not to her pocket, but to the rope hanging from the way station's old alarm bell. A massive brass bell used to signal a fire or raid. They were camped right next to it. "We don't have any book," Beckett said, his voice level. "Don't lie to me." Talon spat. "Give it to me, and we'll let you keep your broken-down ranch. Refuse, and we'll burn you out. Starting now." He nodded to the man with the bruised head. The man grinned, pulled a torch from his pack, and bent to light it from the campfire. "Now, Beckett!" Ava screamed. She didn't run. She yanked the bell rope. The clang of the bell was so loud it was a physical blow. It ripped through the night, a frantic, echoing peal, rolling across the plains. Talon staggered back, his hands over his ears. "You little shooter!" But it was too late. Beckett moved. He didn't go for Talon. He dove behind the stone wall of the way station, his rifle in his hand. He wasn't aiming at anyone. He fired 2 shots, fast, into the air. Bang! Bang! "Town guard!" Beckett roared, his voice amplified by the bell's echo. "They're raiding the station. Get the guard." Talon and his men froze. The way station was only a mile from Brimwillow Junction. The bell and the gunshots would bring the night patrol running. "It's a trick," Talon yelled, but he was already backing up. Get them now!" The man with the torch threw it, not at the camp, but at the stable. It landed in a pile of dry hay. "No!" Ava cried. Beckett fired again, this time at the stable door. The bullet splintered the wood just inches from the henchman's head. The man yelped and dove for cover. Leave it," Talon screamed. "It's not worth a hanging. Get to the horses." They scrambled back into the darkness, the man with the bruised head. In his panic to mount his horse, fumbled. A small, leather-bound book fell from his vest pocket. He didn't notice. He spurred his horse and was gone. Beckett and Eva ran to the stable, stamping out the burning hay. The horses were panicked, but safe. The yard was empty. The sound of hoofbeats was already fading. Eva was breathing hard, her hand still on the bell rope. Beckett stood by the stable, his rifle smoking. Then he saw it. Lying in the dust, illuminated by the light of the dying torch, was the small, leather-bound book. He picked it up. He opened it. It wasn't a ledger. It was a route book. It was full of hand-drawn maps, delivery times, and names. It was the henchman's log of every special delivery he'd made for Rusk. And on the last page, a carefully drawn map of a location just outside Sagebrush Forks, a place not marked on any town map. It was labeled, in a precise, neat hand, Stable No. 3. Ava looked over his shoulder. Her finger traced the map. "The blue calico," she whispered. "The ghost supplies. That's where he's hiding them." Beckett closed the book. The path, which had been a tangled knot of threads, was suddenly a straight, clear line. The final stitch was in place. They didn't sleep, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and the map in the fallen logbook. They rode hard through the remaining darkness, bypassing Brimwillow Junction entirely and cutting southeast, back toward Sagebrush Forks. They left the main road, following the map's cryptic lines along dry creek beds and over low, rocky mesas. Dawn found them not at the town, but in a scrub-filled hollow 2 miles north of it, hidden from the main road. The map called it Stable Number 3. It was no stable. It was a long, low-roofed sod building, built into the side of a ravine. Its door painted the same dull, anonymous red as the railroad freight cars. It looked deserted. Beckett dismounted, his rifle in his hand. "Stay with the horses," he said. "No."
Ava said, swinging down from Juniper. She pulled the heavy, rolled-up bundle of evidence from her saddlebag. I go where the ledger goes. This is my testimony. She was also carrying a small, heavy canvas roll, her emergency sewing kit, but reinforced with heavier tools and all, thick linen thread, and a handful of long, steel harness-mending pins. Beckett looked at her, at the set of her jaw. He nodded once. Stay behind me. No noise. The lock on the door was heavy-duty, but the wood of the jamb was old. Beckett used his knife not on the lock, but on the wood around it. It took 3 hard, silent minutes of prying, the sound muffled by the rising wind, and the jamb splintered. The door swung open with a low groan. The inside smelled of dust, machine oil, and new cloth. It was a treasure trove, not of gold, but of Rusk's deceit. Bolts of canvas, barrels of nails, crates of tools, all bearing the CVR Central Valley Rail stamp. And on a workbench in the back, sitting next to a pot of purple ink, was a small pine box. Beckett moved to cover the door while Eva ran to the bench. She ripped the box open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the duplicate stamp. Next to it, a stack of blank freight receipts, pre-signed by a man she didn't know, and a small ledger.
Beckett,
she breathed, her hands shaking as she held up the stamp. She ran her thumb over the letter R.
No, Nick. It's the fake. It's his.
We have it, Beckett said, his voice low. Now we move. A horse whinnied, not theirs. Beckett spun, shoving Eva behind a stack of barrels. We've been found. The door was blocked by 4 men, silhouetted against the bright morning light. Talon Pierce was in the center, his bowler hat tipped low, a sneer on his face. The man with the bruised temple was at his side. You should have kept running. Hail, Talon said, stepping into the gloom. Rusk doesn't like thieves. Funny, Beckett growled.
That's just what she said about him.
Talon's sneer vanished. Take the book, and the girl, the rancher he's trespassing. You know the law. The man with the bruise lunged, a long knife in his hand. Beckett didn't fire. A gunshot would bring the whole town, and he didn't know if Adair was ready. He met the lunge with the butt of his rifle, a solid crack of wood on bone that sent the man reeling back. A second man uncoiled a rope, snapping it at Beckett's rifle, trying to pull it from his grasp. Horses tied outside began to rear and scream at the sounds of the fight. Get the girl, Talon yelled to the other 2. The 2 henchmen, seeing Beckett occupied, broke for Eva. They had to circle the pile of barrels. Eva didn't run for the door. She ran deeper into the storeroom. Nowhere to run, little seamstress, one of them yelled, laughing as he followed. They rounded the corner and found her backed against a row of heavy wooden stalls. Stalls used for holding freight, not horses. She had her hands up, her back to the wall. Come on, now, the man said, grabbing for her arm. Eva moved with the speed of a striking snake. She wasn't grabbing a weapon. In her hand were 2 of the long, 6-inch steel harness pins from her kit. As the man reached for her, she ducked under his arm and slammed the 2 pins, one after the other, into the heavy iron hinge of the stall gate behind him. She drove them deep into the gap between the hinge and the post, jamming the mechanism. The man grabbed her, but his partner, following close behind, was slammed in the chest as the gate, now blocked, refused to open more than a few inches. What in? The first man turned, confused. Eva brought her all up, not stabbing, but smashing the wooden handle hard against his wrist. He howled and let her go. She darted past him, into the narrow gap of the partially open gate, and slammed her shoulder against it. The gate, jammed by the pins, swung shut, trapping both men in the narrow passage between the stalls. The latch dropped with a heavy, final clang. Open it! Open the door! You! They were trapped, pounding on the heavy wood. In the main room, Beckett had thrown his rope-wielding attacker into a stack of crates. He now faced Talon and the bruised man, who was getting back to his feet. "Eva now!" Beckett yelled, bringing his rifle up. Talon saw his 2 men were gone, trapped. He saw the look in Beckett's eyes. He wasn't here to fight a war. He was here to collect. "Burn it!" Talon shrieked, pulling his pistol. "Burn it all!" The bruised man, grabbing a can of oil, moved to douse the cloth.
Beckett, the cloth, stop him!
Eva screamed from the doorway. But Talon was already aiming. Not at Beckett, at her. He pulled the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot filled the sod building, a deafening, final sound. Beckett had moved the instant he saw Talon's arm rise. He wasn't fast enough to stop the shot, only to change its destination. He threw himself in front of Eva, his body shielding hers. He grunted, a sharp, sudden exhalation of pain, as the bullet tore through the thick muscle of his left shoulder. The force spun him around, and he crashed to his knees, his rifle clattering on the dirt floor.
"Beckett!"
Eva's scream was one of pure terror. Outside, another sound. A bell. Not a warning bell. The courthouse bell. In town. It was ringing for the morning session. 9 o'clock. "The guard!" Talon yelled. "The shots. The bell. They're coming, get out." He didn't wait to see the damage. He and the bruised man bolted, scrambling onto their horses. "To Rusk's ranch now!" Talon screamed, and they were gone. A cloud of dust and panic. Eva dropped to her knees beside Beckett. He was clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of white-hot pain. Blood, dark and thick, was already seeping through his fingers. "The hearing," he gritted out, his teeth clenched. "Adair, we have to go."
"You're shot." It's high," he gasped.
"It went through. We have to go." Eva's panic vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The seamstress took over. A wound was just a tear in the fabric, a seam that had to be closed. She ran to the door, grabbed a clean saddlecloth from her own roll, and tore it into strips. She grabbed a leather saddle string, a pigging string, from his belt.
"Press,"
she commanded. She packed the wound, front and back, with the clean cloth, her hands steady, her face pale. He hissed, his body rigid, but he didn't move. She then took the leather string and wrapped it, tight, around his shoulder and under his arm, creating a tourniquet, a binding stitch to hold the packing in place. It was brutal, but it was fast, and it would hold. "Can you ride?" she asked. "I can ride," he ground out. She looked at the storeroom, at the stamp, the ledger, and at the cloth. "Wait," she said. She ran back into the gloom, to the shelves, her eyes scanning, and she saw it. It was a bolt of cloth, shoved under a pile of canvas. Blue calico, the exact shade. She pulled it out, and there, on the selvage edge, was her mark. When she'd worked in the camp, she'd marked every bolt she'd handled, a small, secret sign of her own. In the pattern, where there were 3 small flowers, she would add a single, tiny, reversed stitch in the center of the 3rd flower, a thread that went left instead of right. It was there.
"I have it,"
she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrible, cold victory.
"I have it all."
She helped Beckett to his feet. He was unsteady, his face gray. She grabbed the box with the stamp, the ledger, and the roll of blue calico. They stumbled outside, into the blinding sun. The town guard, 4 men, were riding hard up the ravine.
"Hale, we heard shots,"
the lead deputy yelled. "It was Talon Pierce," Beckett yelled back, leaning against Boulder.
"He ambushed us. He's heading for Rusk's main ranch."
The deputy and his men didn't hesitate. They spurred their horses, thundering past in pursuit of Talon. "Get to the doctor. Hale!" Beckett and Eva were alone. "No, doctor," Beckett said, pulling himself into the saddle. "The hearing. Now. Eva, we ride." They couldn't ride the horses into town, not with the evidence. They needed the wagon, which they'd left hidden in a grove a mile back. It took them 10 agonizing minutes to reach it, get Beckett settled on the seat, and load their proof. He was slumping, the initial shock wearing off, the deep, throbbing pain setting in. "I'll drive," Ava said, taking the reins. She snapped the leather, and the mules lunged. The wagon crashed onto the main road, a desperate, rattling race against the clock. The courthouse bell had stopped ringing. The hearing was starting. Without them. Every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of agony through Beckett. He was clutching his shoulder, his eyes half closed, but he was holding on. 2 miles from town, the road was rutted, the wagon moving too fast. Crack! The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. The wagon lurched violently, slewing to the side, throwing them both against the rail. A front wheel had broken. "No," Ava breathed, pulling the mules to a frantic, snorting halt. She jumped down. One of the heavy wooden spokes had snapped at the hub, splitting under the speed. The wheel was seconds from collapsing. "We can't," Beckett started, his voice weak. Ava was already moving. She ran to the back, to her sewing kit. She grabbed a long, thick, steel harness pin. She ran back to the wheel. "Rope," she said, her voice sharp. "The lariat." He fumbled, his good arm weak, but he unhooked his rope from the saddle horn. She took it. She jammed the broken spoke back into its socket at the hub. It was loose. She shoved the long steel pin horizontally through the base of the broken spoke, hammering it in with a rock. Then, with a speed that defied belief, she began to weave the rope. She wrapped it around the new steel pin, then around the neighboring spoke, then back, pulling it brutally tight. In, out, loop, pull. She was stitching the wheel. She was sewing wood and steel together with rope. "It won't hold," Beckett whispered. "It will hold," she said, her voice fierce. She tied off the knot, a locking stitch her father had taught her, the kind used to hold a saddle together under the weight of a man. "It will hold to the courthouse." She climbed back onto the seat, her hands raw. "Hiya!" The wagon groaned. The wheel wobbled, but the rope and pin stitch held. It held. They rattled through the outskirts of Sagebrush Forks. People stared. The widower Hale, gray as a ghost, and the seamstress, driving like a freight hauler, her face a mask of dirt and fury. They reached the courthouse. The square was full of horses. Baron Rusk stood on the top step, smoking a thin cigar, watching them pull up. His face was a mask of bored, cold calm. The courthouse bell began to toll again. Not for the hearing. It was tolling noon. Beckett tried to get down from the wagon. He was stiff. He staggered, his legs weak from blood loss. Eva jumped down. She grabbed the box of evidence, the ledger, and the bolt of blue calico. She slammed them onto the boardwalk. Then she turned and offered her hand to Beckett. He looked at her small, calloused hand. He took it. She held him steady, his arm slung over her shoulder. They stood for a moment, facing the door. "Beckett," she said, her voice low, but clear as the noon bell. "We've sewn the last stitch." He nodded, his good hand finding hers and squeezing. They turned and walked up the steps. Rusk watched them, his eyes cold, and blew a casual ring of smoke. Eva kicked the courthouse door open. The room was packed. It fell silent. Every eye Adair's, the magistrates, the towns turned to them, to the blood-soaked rancher and the small, defiant woman who was holding him up, her chin high, her eyes on fire. The heavy doors of the Sagebrush Forks courthouse swung open with a complaining groan. Crashing back against the wall, the sound of the latch was like a gunshot. Every head in the packed, overheated room turned. The collective gasp was audible. There at the entrance stood the cause of the entire hearing, the two people who had become the town's central, scandalous myth, Beckett Hale The Red Hollow widower. His face a ghastly, bloodless gray. His left shoulder was a dark, saturated mass of crimson, his shirt torn, his hand clamped over the wound. And holding him up, her small frame braced against his side, was the seamstress, Ava Marlowe. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with dirt and smoke, her dress torn at the knee. In her free hand, she gripped a bolt of bright blue calico. They looked less like litigants and more like the survivors of a war. At the front of the room, on a raised platform, Magistrate McKinnon, a man whose face was carved from the same granite as the buttes, banged his gavel. Order, order. I say, Baron Rusk sat at a table to the right, looking impeccable in a black wool suit. He showed no surprise, only a flicker of annoyance, as if a servant had interrupted his dinner. Next to him, his lawyer, a slick, pale man from Prescott named Sloane, shuffled his papers. At the other table, Elias Adair shot to his feet, his face a mixture of terror and profound relief. Your Honor, my clients are here. They were detained. So I see. Mr. Adair, McKinnon said, his eyes narrowing at Beckett's shoulder. Mr. Hale, are you fit to stand? I am, Your Honor, Beckett gritted out. Ava helped him to the bench. He didn't sit. He leaned against it. The bolt of calico, the pine box, and the ledger thumping onto the table. The entire room smelled of his blood. Your Honor, Sloane began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. This is precisely the kind of melodrama and vigilantism we are here to discuss. My client, Baron Rusk, is here to petition for the lawful return of his bonded property, one Eva Marlowe. Objection, Adair cried. She is not property. She is an indentured laborer, Sloane countered, bound by a contract, who fled her obligations. She was subsequently accused and fined for the theft of $300 worth of company property, a fine which, I add, Mr. Hale paid in part. He paid in full, Adair yelled. He paid $85.50, Sloane said, smiling at the crowd. A fraction of the total damages. Mr. Hale, then, by his own admission, took Miss Marlowe to his ranch, in violation of her prior contract with the Central Valley Rail Company. We are here to see that contract honored, the remaining debt paid, and Miss Marlowe returned to Mr. Rusk's protective guardianship. The room murmured. It sounded so reasonable, so legal. McKinnon looked at Ava. Miss Marlowe, you stand accused of theft and of breach of contract. What say you? Ava let go of Beckett's hand. She stood alone, facing the magistrate. She was no longer the frightened woman at the depot. She was no longer the cautious guest at the ranch. She was a different person, forged in the fire of the last 24 hours. I say, Ava began, her voice not loud, but it cut through the room, that I am not a debtor. I am a witness. I did not steal the cloth. I was framed, and the man who framed me, she turned, her hand pointing directly at Baron Rusk, did so to cover his own far greater crimes. The room exploded. Rusk's lawyer was on his feet. Outrageous slander. She has no proof. Mr. Sloane. McKinnon boomed, slamming the gavel. Sit down. You have made your accusation. She is making her answer. This is not Prescott. We do not weigh truth by the pound. Continue, Miss Marlowe. Thank you, Your Honor. Ava said. She unrolled the bolt of blue calico, letting it cascade over the table. The color was brilliant in the dusty room. This is the cloth I was accused of stealing. 3 bolts of it. And where did you acquire this evidence? Sloane sneered. From a private, unmarked warehouse owned by Baron Rusk, stable number 3, in the ravine north of town, the same warehouse where my associate, Mr. Talon Pierce. She nodded to Talon, who was sitting behind Rusk, his face pale. Ambushed us this morning. Mr. Hale was shot protecting me from him. Another gasp. Talon jumped to his feet,
That's a lie. I was in town.
Sit down, Mr. Pierce, McKinnon roared. You will have your turn. Eva leaned forward. Your Honor, Mr. Sloane claims this cloth is worth a fortune, but the truth is, it was never meant to be sold. It was a ghost. It was part of an order Baron Rusk billed the railroad for, but which he never intended to deliver. He was going to sell it privately and keep the funds. He needed a scapegoat for the missing inventory. He chose me.
A fantastic story,
Sloane said, chuckling.
But it is just that, a story.
Is it? Eva said. She ran her hand along the edge of the cloth.
I was the head seamstress for the CVR camp. I marked every bolt that came into my workshop, every single one.
She held up the edge. If you'll look closely, Your Honor, at the flower pattern on the selve edge, in every third cluster, I added a single reversed stitch, a mark no one but I would know, a thread that goes left instead of right. She walked the cloth up to McKinnon's bench. Adair handed him a magnifying glass. The magistrate leaned down, his eyes scanning the edge. He was silent for a long time. He found it. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and nodded. Continue.
Eva returned to the table. I kept the real inventory, Your Honor, not just in my head.
She tapped the ledger.
I know the shipments. I know the process. I know the smell of the specific purple ink mister Greaves used on the manifests. I know the way his lamp always left an oil smudge on the bottom right corner of the receipts.
Beckett, his voice a low rasp, pushed the pine box forward. Your Honor, we recovered this from stable number 3, not an hour ago. He flipped the lid. The room was silent.
A company stamp, Beckett said, pushing it forward, and a stack of blank, pre-signed receipts.
Sloane was on his feet.
Your Honor, this is inadmissible. This is fruit of a trespass. They broke into my client's private property.
They were shot. Mr. Sloane, Adair parried.
They were defending themselves from an ambush, and they found the very proof of the crime. I will see the stamp,
McKinnon said. He compared it to the mark on the forged receipt Rusk had filed. He held them up to the light. He could see no difference. They appear identical. Miss Marlowe.
They are, Your Honor,
Eva said.
Almost. But I know the real stamp. I saw it every day. The R in railroad on the real stamp has a tiny nick on the upper curve, a flaw from when it was dropped. This one, she tapped the stamp from the box, is perfect. It's a duplicate, a forgery.
The room was electric. Mr. Adair, McKinnon said, do you have any other witnesses?
I do, Your Honor,
Adair said, his confidence surging.
I call Mr. alias Hemlock of way station number 9.
Hemlock, the sour clerk, walked nervously to the stand. He swore his oath. Mr. Hemlock, Adair asked, did Baron Rusk or his associates ever charge you a territorial holding fee for bonded laborers? Hemlock squirmed. He looked at Rusk. Rusk was staring at him, his face blank. Mr. Hemlock, McKinnon said, his voice a low warning. You are under oath.
Hemlock cracked. Yes, he did. For years he called it a transfer tax, $200, sometimes more. He said it was Prescott law, but it ain't. It's theft. And I signed this.
He held up the paper.
To say so.
Adair took the paper. And I submit this, a sworn affidavit from Deputy Marshal Coltrane, confirming no such fee exists. Sloane was trying to object, but the crowd was turning, the murmurs growing angry. Rusk's legal fees were a rumor no more.
I have one final witness,
Sloane said, his voice strained, trying to regain control. I call Mr. Talon Pierce. Talon walked to the stand. He looked sick.
Mr. Pierce,
Sloane asked, did you or did you not see Miss Marlowe steal the blue calico? Talon licked his lips. He looked at Rusk. Rusk gave a small, almost imperceptible nod.
Yes,
Talon said, his voice a rasp.
I saw her. She was hiding it in her kit.
And this stamp, this stable number 3, this ambush, it's all a fabrication, is it not?
Yes,
Talon whispered.
A lie. All of it.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. No further—
One moment,
Ava said, stepping forward. Adair motioned her on. Mr. Pierce, you are left-handed. Are you not? Talon looked confused.
What yes? What of it?
So when you use a stamp, you press it with your left hand. Correct.
I suppose.
And you often brace the paper with your right.
Get to the point, Miss Marlowe,
McKinnon said, leaning forward.
The point, Your Honor,
Ava said. Is that last night, Mr. Pierce and his men ambushed us at Way Station 9 in his haste to flee when we raised the alarm. He dropped this. She held up the small, leather-bound logbook. Talon's face went from pale to the color of ash. This is his route book, Ava said, her voice ringing with cold victory. It details every special delivery, every barrel of damaged goods, every trip to stable number 3.
It's forged,
Talon shrieked, half rising from his chair. Is it? Ava said. She opened it to the last page.
Here is a practice receipt. He was testing the stamp, the fake stamp.
She walked to the witness box. She pointed, not at the book, but at Talon's left hand, which was gripping the rail. And here is the proof, the same proof Mr. Greaves, the other left-handed stamper, used to have a purple ink smudge on the heel of his left palm, from bracing his hand on the wet ink of the fake stamp, the stamp he just swore he'd never seen. Every eye in the room swiveled to Talon's hand. The purple crescent was faint, but it was there. Talon looked at his hand, at Ava, at Rusk. The trap was sprung. He was caught. The room was utterly, completely silent.
Bang!
McKinnon's gavel strike was like a cannon shot.
This court,
he said, his voice shaking with a cold fury,
has heard enough.
He stood. This court finds that the debt, all debts, attached to Miss Eva Marlowe, are a criminal fabrication. They are nullified. The labor contract is void. Miss Marlowe, you are a free woman. A roar went up from the crowd.
Order,
McKinnon yelled, banging again. This court fines Baron Rusk $500 to be paid to the town treasury for the malicious and fraudulent use of territorial contract law.
Your Honor, this is an outrage,
Sloan yelled. And finally, McKinnon said, his eyes locking on Rusk, this court is opening a full territorial investigation into the business practices of the Central Valley Rail Company under the authority of the UWAT, Marshall and Prescott, effective immediately. This hearing is adjourned. The room exploded. People were cheering, standing on benches. Adair was crying. Rusk sat perfectly still amid the chaos. His lawyer was grabbing his arm, sputtering, but Rusk just stared at Ava. Slowly, he stood. He adjusted his suit coat. He picked up his hat. He walked past the celebration, his steps unhurried. He paused as he drew level with Eva and Beckett. The noise died around them, a small pocket of cold silence. He leaned in, his voice a soft, venomous whisper.
Freedom,
he said, his eyes on Ava's, has a price. You'll find it's much higher than you think. He turned and walked, unhurried, out of the courthouse. A man leaving a party, not a defeat. The threat settled, cold and heavy. Then the noise rushed back in. The adrenaline that had held Beckett upright for an hour evaporated. He groaned, his knees buckling, and he sat hard on the bench, his head falling forward as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. The crowd surged, but Ava saw only him. She pushed through the well-wishers. kneeling in front of him. He was pale, his eyes closed in pain. She put her hand on top of his, the one that was trying to hold his shoulder together. Her hand was steady. Her grip was not soft or comforting. It was firm, practical, strong as a sewing clamp.
"Beckett,"
she said. He opened his eyes.
"We're done."
He nodded, a faint, pained smile. Across the room, the editor of the Sagebrush Sentinel was scribbling furiously, a grin on his face. He already had his headline: "The Seamstress and the Rancher, How a Needle Felled a Debt Empire." Ava saw him. She looked at the celebrating town. She looked at Rusk's empty chair. Then she looked at Beckett. She smiled, a small, exhausted smile that was just for him. The victory wasn't the headline. It wasn't the fine. It was the moment McKinnon had looked at her and said, "Miss Marlowe is a free woman." She had won her name back. That was all that mattered. They rode back to Red Hollow as the sun was setting. The doctor had stitched Beckett's wound, and Adair had fixed their wagon wheel. The world was quiet. The sky a deep bruised purple streaked with gold. The land, which had been a place of ambush and fear, was just land again. The pastures were quiet. The sun, as it dipped behind the buttes, was not a harsh white, but a soft, warm light that washed the valley, the color of spilled honey on the tall grass. The night was profoundly quiet. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, and the world outside the cabin windows felt new, cold, and vast. The only sound was the creek, no longer a dry whisper, but a full, contented murmur, and the occasional soft stamp of the mules in the barn. The rain was over. Beckett sat on the porch, his chair tilted back against the log wall he'd fought for. His left arm was in a sling, the doctor's neat white bandages a stark contrast to his dark shirt. The laudanum the doctor had given him had dulled the sharp, tearing fire of the bullet wound to a deep, heavy, throbbing ache, a rhythm he could almost breathe to. He was alive. He was still here. The cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow lamplight onto the porch. Ava stood there. She had washed the dirt and smoke from her face, and her dark honey hair was damp. She held 2 tin mugs. She didn't ask if he wanted anything. She just walked over and handed him one. It was hot. The steam rose in the cold air, carrying the sharp, clean scent of mint. "Mrs. Tilda's recipe," she said, her voice quiet. "She always said it settled the dust." She sat, not in the other chair, but on the top step near his feet, wrapping her arms around her knees. They sat in a shared, comfortable silence, drinking the tea, listening to the night. Rusk's threat still hung in the air, a cold spot in the new peace. But it was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight was for breathing. Ava finished her tea and set the mug down. From the pocket of her skirt, she drew the small, cedar comb. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall. It was long, reaching the middle of her back. She turned slightly, away from him, and began to brush. Beckett watched her. The lamplight caught the smooth, dark wood of the comb. Each stroke was slow, measured, and full of intention. A long, smooth pull from her temple to the ends. He could hear the faint, whispering shush as the teeth passed through the strands. She was not just untangling her hair. She was combing out the day, combing out the fear, combing out the smell of the sod house, the sound of the gunshot, the faces of the jury, the cold, dead eyes of Talon Pierce. She was combing out the rope burns, the auction block, the foreman's leering smile. She was combing out Rusk, stroke by stroke. She was brushing out the last of her old life, making way for the new. He watched until his chest felt tight. "That's Cypress," he said, his voice rough. Ava paused, the comb resting in her lap. She looked at him. "The one on the rise," he continued, his gaze fixed on the dark, pointed shape of the tree against the stars. Where Lydia is."
"It's a beautiful tree,"
she said softly, knowing this was a road he had not walked with anyone. I buried something else there," he said, the words costing him, each one a heavy stone pulled from his chest. "After the flood, when I lost them, I found his shoes, 2 of them, so small." He stopped. The admission was out, a fragile, wounded thing in the cold night air. "I buried them in a box, right next to her. It was all I had left of him. It's a marker, a place for memory." Ava was silent for a long time. She looked at the old, dark tree, a shadow of grief against the sky. Then she looked at the open, fallow ground beside it. "We should plant another one," she said, her voice clear and steady. He turned to look at her. "What?" "A new one," she said. "A sapling, right next to it, not to replace, but to add. The old one is for what was. The new one can be for what is, for what will be." He stared at her, at this woman who had seen the absolute worst of men and still spoke of planting new things. She saw his grief, his sealed-off wound, and she didn't just offer comfort, she offered growth. The ache in his shoulder was nothing compared to the sudden, sharp ache in his throat. He looked at her hands clasped around her knees, at the comb in her lap, at the quiet strength that held her spine straight as a needle. She was a free woman. She owed him nothing. The debt was paid, the contract void. She could leave. She could take the morning stage to Prescott, to anywhere, and start a new life. The thought of it, of this new shared silence in the cabin vanishing, of it returning to the old, dead quiet. It was a cold, sudden panic. "Stay," he said. The word was small, rough, and hung in the air between them. It was not, "Stay, I need you." It was not, "Stay, I'm ordering you." It was not even, "Stay, I love you." It was just stay. A question, a request for a future, the most vulnerable thing he had ever said. Ava turned her head. She looked at his face, at the pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with the bullet, at the deep, carved lines of his loneliness. She saw the man who had paid $100, who had respected her silence, who had thrown himself in front of a bullet for her. She saw the man who had shared his most private, painful memory on a dark porch. She didn't speak. She just held his gaze, and, after a long, steady moment, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was done. The defenses were gone. There was no more guarding, no more caution. There was only choice. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since the day Lydia died. He nodded back, a single, sharp dip of his chin. They sat for another minute, and the quiet was no longer empty. It was full. "It's cold," she said, finally. "The doctor said you shouldn't get chilled. Let's go in." She stood, picked up the mugs, and he followed her, his good arm pushing him up from the chair. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon of warmth. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of coals. The single oil lamp on the kitchen table cast a soft, amber light, making the shadows in the corners deep and soft. Ava put the mugs in the wash basin. She turned and paused. She looked at the log wall, at the spot where his rain gauge hung. She took her cedar comb, the one she had just used to brush out her past, and she tucked it firmly into the same crack, its handle resting beside his tin bracket. It was not a temporary placement. It was a statement, a flag planted. "I am here. This is home." She turned to him. He was standing by the table, watching her, his face unreadable in the soft light. His arm was in its sling, making him seem both powerful and defensive. She, Ava, the woman who had been property, the woman who had been stalked and sold and shot at, made her choice. She walked to him. She didn't hesitate. She stepped inside his guard, into the space that was his. She was small enough that her head only came to his uninjured shoulder. She gently, carefully, wrapped her arms around his back, her hands spreading wide over the warm flannel, holding him. Beckett froze. His entire body went rigid. This was not the desperate, storm-fueled kiss. This was not a shared survival. This was a quiet, deliberate act of intimacy. He could feel her breath against his chest. He relaxed. A long, slow sigh shuddered out of him. With his one good arm, he wrapped it around her, his hand settling in the small of her back, holding her just as firmly. He held her. He could feel her heart beating, a steady, calm rhythm against his own. He buried his face in her clean, damp hair and just breathed her in. "You're safe," he whispered into her hair.
"I know,"
she whispered back, her voice muffled against his shirt. He leaned back, just enough to see her face. She looked up at him. He moved his hand, his good hand, from her back, bringing it up to her side, slowly, deliberately, over the fabric of her dress. His calloused, gentle fingers slid up her ribs, charting her. He paused, his hand cupping her side, his thumb just below her arm, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. He was making sure she was still with him, still choosing this. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He kissed her. It was a slow, deep, and knowing kiss. It was not the desperate crash of the storm. It was the deep, calm, steady pull of the river after. It was warm. It was safe. It was the end of running. She smiled, a small, quiet laugh that vibrated against his lips. He responded with a low, contented sound in his chest. This was not passion born of fear. It was peace, finally taking root. She pulled back, her hands still linked behind his back. "Dance with me," she whispered. "Ava," he said, gesturing to his arm. "And there's no music." "We don't need it," she said. She took his good hand, placed it on her waist. She laid her head on his uninjured shoulder, and she began to hum, a low, tuneless sound. They began to move. It was just a slow, shuffling circle in the middle of the kitchen, their boots scuffing the wide pine planks. 1 step, 2 steps, a shared breath. His broad, solid frame, her small, strong one. His limp, her grace. They fit. The sound of their footsteps on the floor was the only percussion, the beating of their 2 hearts the only rhythm. She held him, and he held her. They danced in the firelight, 2 shadows on the wall, separate at the feet, but joined at the heart, becoming a single, moving shape. She lifted her head, her lips close to his ear. "I'm not in your debt, Beckett Hale," she whispered, her voice fierce and soft. "I'm not in anyone's. I don't owe anyone except myself a decent life." She pulled back so she could see his eyes. "And I choose to share it with you." The words hit him harder than the bullet had. He had no words, nothing to match the sheer, simple power of her gift. So he acted. He looked down at her left wrist, pale in the lamplight. Faded, but still visible, was the small, chafed scar from the depot, where the rope had burned her skin, the mark of her bondage. He lifted her hand, and slowly, with a reverence that was almost a prayer, he bent his head and pressed his lips gently to that small, faded scar. It was a kiss that sealed the wound, a final stitch, not to hide the scar, but to acknowledge it, to heal it, to make it part of their story, a quiet, unspoken vow that no one would ever bind her again. Ava's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of release. They stood, just holding each other, for a long time. Later, they sat by the fire, not on the chairs, but side by side on the braided rug, their shoulders touching. The tension was gone, replaced by a warm, quiet stillness. Beckett reached for the new ledger, the one that wasn't hidden under the floor. He opened it to a fresh page. "The season's turning," he said, his voice practical, but with a new, warm undertone. "We need a list." Eva took the pen. Her handwriting, so sharp and precise, filled the page. 1, she wrote. Plow and seed the east pasture with Timothy hay. 2, Beckett added, his eyes on the fire. Rehang the main barn door. New hinges. Iron this time.
3,
Eva wrote, a small smile playing on her lips. Clear the north corner of the main room, build shelves, and a cutting table. He looked at her. A cutting table?
For my sewing room,
she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I'll need to take on work. Mrs. Adair needs a new dress, and the doctor's wife, she sews like a blind badger. We'll need the income. He looked at the list. Hay, barn, sewing room. It was a list of a future, a shared one. A good, solid table, he agreed, his voice thick. Oak, I have some seasoned planks in the loft. Outside, the stars were a brilliant, cold spray against the black, empty sky. The wind whispered in the pines, a sound of peace. Inside, the fire burned low, a steady, warm heart. The two shadows on the wall were no longer separate. They were leaning on each other, a single, solid shape, finally at rest. Rusk's loss in the courthouse was not a defeat. It was a humiliation. And Baron Rusk was not a man who tolerated public humiliation. The territorial investigation was looming, but it was slow, based miles away in Prescott, tied up in paperwork. Rusk was, for the moment, still a free man. His assets frozen, but his malice unbound. He had lost his power of paper. He turned, instead, to the power of fire. The threat came 3 nights after the hearing. The air was dry, and a hot, dangerous wind was blowing from the east, rattling the windows of the Red Hollow cabin. Beckett was asleep. The deep, exhausted sleep of a man finally at peace. His arm, still in its sling, resting on the blankets. Eva was at the table, finishing the last stitch on a new shirt, when she smelled it. It was not the comforting, resinous scent of their pine hearth. It was the sharp, acrid, running smell of dry grass on fire. She dropped the shirt and ran to the window. A low orange glow was licking the horizon. It was on their land.
Beckett,
she screamed, her voice high with a new, fresh terror.
Beck-Bet, wake up fire.
He was out of the bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, the fog of sleep and laudanum vanishing. He threw the door open and his heart stopped. It was not a wildfire. It was a statement. A long, perfect line of flames, a mile wide, had been set in his eastern pasture. The wind was driving it, a roaring wall of destruction. Straight toward the barn, straight toward the house. Rusk, Beckett breathed. The name a curse. "The bell!" he roared at Eva. "Ring the alarm. Ring it till your arms fall off." He didn't wait to see her run to the porch. He grabbed the wet burlap sacks he always kept in the water trough, his rifle, and ran toward the barn. The heat was already intense, a physical, hateful presence. Eva seized the rope of the heavy brass bell. She pulled, and the night shattered. Clang, clang, clang. The sound, frantic and desperate, rolled across the dark valley. A plea for help against an enemy that wouldn't sleep. This was the difference. When the flood had come, Beckett Hale had been alone. He was not alone now. Within 10 minutes, they came. Riders, silhouetted against the flames. Their neighbors. Elias Hemlock from the way station. Deputy Coltrane, off duty. 2 ranchers from the next valley over. Men who had hated Rusk's water fees but had been too afraid to speak. They came with shovels and more sacks, and their own quiet, grim fury. "He's fired the pasture," Beckett yelled, his voice raw from the smoke. "He's trying to burn us out. We have to make a break at the creek. If it jumps the creek, it takes the barn." They were a small, coughing, desperate army. Beckett, his wounded shoulder a searing white-hot agony. Took the lead, his shovel biting deep into the dry earth. They were digging a firebreak, a long, shallow trench, turning the fuel of the grass into a wall of bare dirt. Eva, Adair, and the others worked the line, beating at the leaping, 8-foot-high flames with the heavy, soaked burlap. The heat was a living thing, a monster that clawed at their faces, stealing their breath, stinging their eyes. The smoke was a black, choking blanket. They fell back, line by line, the fire laughing at their small ditch. "It's moving too fast," Hemlock cried, his face black with soot. "The wind is too strong." They were losing. The fire was 50 yards from the barn. The paint on the walls was already blistering.
"The barn!"
Ava shrieked, her voice cracking.
"Look!"
It was a nightmare. While their eyes were on the main blaze, a second, smaller fire had bloomed. Talon Pierce, using the chaos as a shield, had crept from the darkness. He was standing directly against the hay barn, a lit torch in his hand. He grinned, his face a demonic mask in the light of the flames, and raised the torch to the dry, waiting hay inside. "No!" Beckett roared. He was too far, trapped on the wrong side of his own firebreak. He raised his rifle, but his arm was shaking. The shot impossible. Talon laughed and lunged with the torch. Eva was closer. She had been running water from the well, her arms aching. She didn't have her pepper. She didn't have her all. She ran at him, screaming his name. Talon turned, surprised, his free arm coming up to strike her down. Eva's hand flew to the pocket of her dress. It was empty, save for one thing. The cedar comb. She didn't think, she reacted, with a cry that was part rage, part despair. She threw it, with all her strength. The comb, her mother's gift, her anchor, her last piece of the past, sailed through the smoky air. It struck Talon's torch hand, the wooden teeth scraping hard across his knuckles. It was not heavy, it was not a weapon, but it was a shock. It was a sting. He yelped, a high, thin sound of surprise, and his hand flinched. He fumbled the torch. It fell, it hit the dirt, sputtered, and rolled, harmless, 6 inches from the dry hay. That one single second was all Beckett needed. He vaulted his own firebreak, a wave of pain so intense it almost made him black out. He hit Talon with the full force of his body, his good shoulder slamming into the man's chest like a battering ram. The impact was brutal. They crashed to the ground. Beckett, fueled by a rage that was older than Rusk, older than the flood, did not stop. He was a man defending his home. He pinned Talon to the ground, his good hand finding the man's throat. "You will not burn this house," he hissed, his voice a low, terrifying sound. Talon clawed at him, but the fight was gone, replaced by pure terror. Beckett was no longer the quiet, sad widower. He was a force of nature. Beckett grabbed the rope from Talon's own belt and, with swift, vicious yanks, tied his hands and feet. He left him trussed in the yard like a steer, and turned back to the real fight. The main fire was still roaring. His neighbors were exhausted, beaten back to the barn wall. It was over. And then it happened. Splat! A single fat drop of rain hit Beckett's soot-covered cheek. He looked up. The sky, which had been clear and starry save for the smoke, was gone. A low black ceiling had rolled in, silent and fast. Splat! 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 A sudden, unforecasted high prairie deluge opened up. It was not a rain. It was a curtain of water. It fell, cold and heavy. The rain hit the firewall, and the world dissolved in steam. A sound like a million snakes hissing, a roar of steam and thunder, and the orange light died. It was snuffed out, not by their shovels, not by their sacks, but by the sky. The neighbors stood, stunned, soaked to the bone in the sudden, blessed cold. Their faces streaked with mud and soot. They looked at the sky. then at the hissing, blackened field. "Well," Hemlock said, his voice awed, "I'll be—" The rain brought more than relief. As the gray, wet, smoky dawn broke, 2 official wagons rolled into the Red Hollow yard. They were not neighbors. They were uniformed men, wearing the badges of the territorial marshals. The lead marshal, a man with a hard, square jaw, looked at the scene, at the burned pasture, the trussed-up Talon Pierce, the exhausted, soot-covered ranchers. "Mr. Beckett Hale?" he asked. "I am," Beckett said, pulling a wet sack from his uninjured shoulder. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Baron Rusk," the marshal said, his voice flat. "Based on an investigation into mail fraud and abuse of territorial contracts. And now, it seems arson. This man," he nudged Talon with his boot, "is a good start." They found Rusk at his ranch, sitting in his office. He was not packing. He was just sitting in his fine leather chair, staring at his useless ledgers. A man who had run out of numbers. They marched him out onto the boardwalk, his fine suit soaked and spattered with mud. He was silent. He saw Beckett and Eva standing in their ruined pasture, watching him. Rusk's face was a mask of cold stone. He said nothing. The only sound in the wet morning was the sharp, final click of the iron handcuffs locking onto his wrists. His silence was heavy as lead, but the cuffs, Beckett thought, were heavier. The new dawn rose on a changed Red Hollow. The eastern pasture was a scar, a vast, black, ugly patch on the face of the land. But a week later, Beckett was walking the fence line. The land looked dead. But it wasn't. In the very center of the black field, protected by a small, rocky rise, a patch of the original Timothy grass had survived. The heart of the pasture, its green, living center, was untouched. Beckett knelt. He touched the green grass, then the black soot. He understood. The scar was real. The fire had happened. The flood had happened. Rusk had happened. But the center, the heart, had held. Life began again, stitched from new thread. Eva's sewing room was the first priority. Beckett used the seasoned oak he'd saved, building her a cutting table so smooth it felt like glass. He moved Lydia's old machine, cleaned and oiled, into the new space. Eva painted a small, simple shingle herself and hung it from the porch. Marlowe, seamstress, fair prices, honest work. The women came, first Mrs. Adair, then 2 ranch daughters from the valley, who came not for dresses, but for lessons. "Can you teach us?" one of them asked, holding up her own clumsy mending. Eva looked at them, and she remembered the railroad camp. She remembered the price of cloth. She nodded. She taught them to draft, to measure, to stitch a seam as strong as a promise. She paid them for their work, and they sold their goods in town. No one in Sagebrush Forks, she vowed, would ever be bound by a fabric debt again. Beckett, too, was building. His act of healing was not with thread, but with water. The main creek on his land was the most reliable water source, the one Rusk had always charged for. Beckett spent a week reinforcing the well, building a new, wide trough for horses and buckets, and he put up his own sign, carved deep into a pine board. It read, "Red Hollow Water, free, bring your own bucket." One evening, Beckett found Eva on the porch. She was holding the cedar comb. The fire it was scorched. One of the teeth had been broken in the throw. She was sanding it, her hands moving slowly, trying to fix what was lost. He sat beside her, took it from her hand. He went to his workshop and returned with his smallest file and a piece of fine sandpaper. He sat, and with a carpenter's gentle precision, he filed the broken tooth smooth. He sanded away the black scorch mark, leaving only the clean, warm wood. He rubbed it with oil until the grain shone. "It's not the same," he said, handing it back. "But it's not broken." She took it. It was different, stronger, reshaped by fire, mended by his hands. She stood. She walked to the main porch post, the one that held up the roof, the one that faced the dawn. She took a hammer and a single, clean nail, and she nailed the comb firmly to the post. It was no longer a talisman, hidden in a pocket. It was not a charm against fear. It was a declaration, a symbol of choice, nailed to the heart of their home. They were tied, as the prairie folks said. In the late spring, the cottonwoods were releasing their seeds, and the air was filled with white, floating fluff, like a gentle snow in the warm sunshine. Magistrate McKinnon performed the service. They stood by the creek, under the 2 cypress trees, the old, dark one, heavy with memory, and the new green sapling they had planted beside it, the one of hope. There were few people, the Adaires, the doctor, Ava's new students, but there was a great deal of light. Beckett wore the gray vest she had sewn for him. His shoulder healed to a dull, puckered scar. Eva wore a dress of blue calico. She had taken the bolt from stable number 3, the cloth that had been her accusation, her evidence, and her victory. She had stitched it into a dress of triumph, the pattern of small flowers, with her own secret, reversed stitch, a quiet map of her survival. That night, they stood on the porch, under the new moon. Ava leaned her head against his good shoulder, smiling into the darkness. "What is it?" he asked.
I was just remembering,
she whispered.
that night, the storm.
She pressed herself, just as she had then, against the log cabin wall. She smiled. She pressed against the log cabin wall, while the lonely rancher moved his hand upward. He looked at her, and his heart was so full he could not speak. She took his hand, the large, calloused hand that had held a rifle, and a hammer, and a shovel, the hand that had mended her comb. She brought it to her lips.
I remember I was so afraid,
she whispered. But the hand, it wasn't moving to take anything. It was moving to clear the way, to pull me to safety. He turned, his shadow covering hers. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek, his touch gentle and sure. "I will always," he said, his voice a low, rough promise, "pull you to safety." He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the storm, or the pained kiss of the courthouse. It was the kiss of a beginning. It was certain. It was quiet. It was home. They stood for a long moment, under the stars and the shadow of the comb nailed to the post. Then, together, they turned and walked back inside the house, a place where the log walls had finally learned how to shelter, not to imprison. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and especially where in the world you're listening from. Please let us know in the comments below to connect and share your feelings. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and please like this video. It helps us greatly. And if you'd like to support us even more, please consider hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more folks.